A lot of the missiles that they're using need to be relying on foreign components. That's why you're seeing him relying on Iranian drones more and more, because he can't make up for their stockpiles.
Well, that's just blatantly untrue. Any military analysis who works in logistics knows that Russia can produce 100 times more in a single month than the United States can produce in a year.
You know what? I am not an expert in this whatsoever, so I'm just gonna leave it at that. But
so my position remains my position remains the same as it always has been.
Well, I'm not trying to debate you off of it. I'm just more confused.
No, it's fine. I'm just.
We have J.Y. Lewis going up against Dylan Burns TV. You can find Dylan Burns over on Twitch, but I'm going to let him shout himself out real quick and just briefly tell the audience a little bit about himself as he makes his debut on the Crucible. Go ahead, Dylan.
Hi, I'm Dylan Burns. A lot of people know me because I used to host the Hippy Dippy Roundtable. Now I'm more concentrating on foreign affairs. I just got back from Ukraine. I went over there to interview soldiers, interview civilians about the war, talk to aid workers, and participate in a very small amount of aid work myself.
Thank you so much for that intro. Now you worked professionally, like as a canvasser and on campaigns as well, didn't you, Dylan?
Yep. Well, not professionally. It was just like always as a volunteer. I did work for like a few campaigns, but I always did it as a volunteer. I canvassed in Georgia for John Ossoff and Warnock. I'm going to go back down to Georgia to canvass for Warnock again. Canvass for Bernie, canvass for a lot of people, yeah.
Gotcha. And then J.Y. Lewis, same to you. Tell everybody where they can find you and just briefly a little bit about yourself.
You can find me in the Orient, but if you don't want to fly there, you can always find me on Twitter, I guess. I'm floating around there. I also use Discord on and off, so people know me from around there. Besides that, that's about it.
All right. Thank you so much for that, gentlemen. You'll have 7 minutes on the clock for your opening statement. We're going to start with JY and let him open. I always want to mix that up with JF because he's on the show so often. But what's it, J.Y. Lewis? You've got 7 minutes on the clock. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the question at hand about the geopolitical situation that's going on in Ukraine between Russia and more broadly the West, NATO, can be summed up very simply that any person that opposes Russia's invasion or military action or however you want to label it, often is doing so from a very Western-centric perspective. And I think that anybody who removes themselves from that and kind of applies the same standards that they're applying to Russia would find that there's inconsistencies across the board in any conflict. While conflict in general is a tragedy and we should attempt to avoid it, it's dishonest, in my opinion, to ignore the historical and political realities that cause these kind of conflicts to take place. All too often, the West, particularly NATO, has free reign over the media to be able to narrate and create narratives as they please. And so, as a result, it's very easy to just shout platitudes like, "Ma, Russia evil," "Ma, Soviets," "Ma, Donald Trump controlled by Russia," et cetera, et cetera. Things like these platitudes often don't answer the complex geopolitical situations that we find ourselves in. And so just a quick overview. The conflict in Ukraine is something that has been broiling for at least since the start of the Russian Federation, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it is large part due to mismanagement of the managed decline of the Soviet Union. The Soviet leaders did a horrendous job of managing the breakup of this power. And as a result, a lot of things that were assumed on the part of Russia were not assumed on the part of the West. And so what we find is that NATO wants Russia to hold all the burdens of being the largest state of the former Soviet Union, but also give it none of the respect that it's earned. And so because of that, people feel like they can treat Russia as if it's some geopolitical backwater, which is not the reality of the situation. And so what we see is that NATO and the United States have increasingly provoked action in Ukraine and in the Russian sphere of influence by breaking numerous promises and treaties that were baked into the cake for the Soviets, but for some reason doesn't apply to the Russian Federation, even though the Russian Federation had to take all of the debt that the Soviets incurred. And so there's this disconnect with the political reality from Western mindset. And with that, furthermore, I think that the NATO and the United States more broadly, along with Ukraine, are generally hypocritical in how they criticize Russian intervention in the Ukraine situation. While I don't necessarily support the invasion in a strict sense, because I think that all war is tragedy, I also can be understanding and come to reasoned conclusions as to why something happens. And that'll be my opening.
Appreciate that opening statement very much. With 3 minutes left on the clock, Dylan Burns, whenever you're ready, go ahead with your response.
So, I am a big supporter of sending more aid to Ukraine. That's my position. I advocate for it constantly, and I've been engaged in trying to get aid to Ukraine personally through body armor, medical gauze, ATVs, stuff like that. So my position on this, I think, for most people is pretty clear. I support the Ukrainian government. I think a lot of people, though, when studying this war, it kind of starts for most people on February 24th. Where it is true, as Lewis said, that this conflict has been boiling for a much longer period of time. You can go back to 2014, you can go back to 2004, you can go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, you could go back to the Russian Empire's collapse of the Soviet Union. You could go back to Voltaire's writings about how Ukraine desires to be free and the Ukrainians want independence. You can go back and talk about the UPA or any number of different Ukrainian independence struggles in fighting with authorities in Moscow. But I think the easiest place to start when analyzing this war isn't necessarily February 24th. I think it'd probably be 2014. Even though most of the studying should be, of course, past February 24th. And so what happened in February in 2014 is that there was a association agreement that Yanukovych said and promised that he was going to join. He said he was going to join. He said this on the campaign trail. He was going to join this association agreement with the EU, which allowed visa-free travel of Ukrainians, which helped with labor regulations and a bunch of, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty, but it was an association agreement that he promised to get in that many Ukrainians saw as progressing the Ukrainian state and allowing them to have access to European labor markets. And it was popular. But eventually, Yanukovych went back on this promise. He said he wasn't going to join the association agreement, and instead he wanted to join a separate agreement with the Russian Federation. Now, there's a lot of speculation exactly why he did this, if whether there was some backroom dealing that pressured him to do it, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is that he promised on the campaign trail he was going to do something, and then he did the exact opposite. This led to student protesters going onto the streets and protesting against the government. These student protesters were reacted to very violently, with beatings, with flashbangs that had nails and bolts and screws tied to them. They were thrown into crowds. The Berkut. Then, eventually, through the escalation of these protests, as more people came and joined this protest movement, ended up killing people. And as more people died, the protests obviously got more angry until it eventually led to Yanukovych fleeing the country after multiple failed negotiations. After he fled the country, a new election was held where Poroshenko was elected. But during this period of you could say, chaos in the Ukrainian state, during this period, there is one last thing I need to add. A big thing that motivated a lot of protesters that I interviewed to come out was when Yanukovych tried to make it illegal to protest, tried to stop gatherings of more than 3 people, tried to stop protest against the government. For a lot of people, they saw the passage of that law as leading to like a point of no return where they would never be able to protest against the government again. So Russia took this opportunity to protect what it considers its strategic interests in Crimea. They invaded Crimea while lying about it the entire time. They then funneled weapons to rebels in the Donbass, who then ended up taking settlement after settlement before fighting the Ukrainian military, and that eventually froze. After they funneled weapons in there, and they had people like Igor Girkin, former FSB agents who basically ran the Donbass rebels. These FSB agents are not really, as you would say, classical politicians. They are agents of the Russian state. They have been in control of the Donbass for the last 8 years. Eventually, as 2022 came around, we saw more buildup of Russian soldiers on the border, which eventually led to them saying, no, it's just military training, don't worry about it. And then there was some negotiations that might have happened, but they were shut down, and the invasion occurred. And then thousands of more people died. And now, since then, we're living in that reality. And so instead of stating my position, I just want to give some people just like a basic like historical backdrop for what happened pre-2022, pre-February 24th, and starting in 2014. For me, I think the Euromaidan revolution was righteous. I think the Euromaidan revolution was good. I think it was advocating for positive things. And I think Yanukovych shouldn't have fled. I think he should have been arrested. And I think that the trickling out from the Euromaidan revolution and Yanukovych fleeing is eventually what led to this specific invasion. But this is still the ripplings of what has been Russia's historic position on Ukraine, which is that Ukraine doesn't exist, that Ukrainian identity is fake, it is just a shoot-off, that the Ukrainian language is bastardization. We hear Dmitry Medvedev, who's the former president of Russia and right hand of Vladimir Putin, say Ukraineness is a disease of the mind. We constantly hear from Putin his interests when it came to invading this country and denying Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian right to a nation state. And personally, I disagree with that. From my discussions with Ukrainians, I think it's very clear that they want to govern their own state. They want to go a different path than Russia has chosen for itself. And I think that is the right of every nation state to choose itself. And maybe if Russia had a better relationship with its neighbors, then it wouldn't be scaring them all away.
Thanks, Dylan. With 1 minute left on the clock. Ladies and gentlemen, make sure that you like, share, subscribe, do all the YouTube shit that you're supposed to do that helps bump us in the algorithm. Also, consider becoming a channel member so that we can keep bringing these great debates to you. We appreciate Dylan coming on for his debut tonight. With that, we're going to open up the floor. Gentlemen, go ahead.
Well, I think that your overall position and kind of historical analysis is obviously, it seems to me, clouded by Western narratives. It's very easy to say Russia bad without considering the geopolitical situation that Russia is in, and the historical understanding that Russia has always been the odd man out and getting beat up on the international stage. So I think that a lot of what you said was basically could just be hand waved and said, hey, that, that's US propaganda, just as much as you would hand wave some of the narratives that I would give as Russian propaganda. So, that's silly, because the Russians claim, for example, that the coup attempt on Yanukovych, if I'm getting his name right, was a color revolution instituted by the CIA.
How?
But of course, you would say, well, that's ridiculous. That's Russia propaganda. But I'm like, well, the Russians claim that. How are they any less right than you?
Well,
when there's just as many geopolitical interests for NATO.
Well, I guess the reason I would say that it wasn't a CIA orchestrated coup is because the CIA didn't orchestrate the coup. You can go look at the players involved during the Euromaidan revolution. I've interviewed many of them. I've talked to them at length. The CIA did not give them guns. The CIA did not funnel them a bunch of bandages or rocks to throw at police. They didn't organize, okay, we need protesters at this building, then they're going to move over to this. There's no evidence that ever happened. And so when somebody says that there was a CIA coup, the reason I hand wave it isn't because, it's the Russian line or because the Russians said it. The Russians can say things that are true or not true. It depends on the facts on the ground. The reason I say that it isn't a coup, and I would say it's more of a protest movement, or if we want to get kind of LARPy about it, a revolution, which is what people call it, is because there's no evidence that the CIA orchestrated an overthrow of the Yanukovych regime whatsoever. The only evidence I ever see presented to me is a phone call where a U.S. official says that Poroshenko's their guy and they hope he gets in office after this is all over, which we know countries have said this about elections and world events before. If you asked Biden, who do you think should be in power in any number of countries, In private, he'll probably say, oh, I want that person because that would best serve my interests, or I want that person because I think they're better for the country or better for the region. And so I think it would be on the Russian supporter to show how it was a CIA coup. What's the evidence for it?
Yeah, so I don't think, again, I think that was kind of more of a hand wave than an actual a point in your favor, because all you're saying is there's no evidence for, well, why would the CIA leave evidence? One, but first off, they brag about it openly. One of Trump's top advisors brags about how they were purposefully breaking up and supported schismatic, a large group of schismatic churches in the Ukraine to split away from the church that was under the MP. That's a direct admission by the top guy in the Trump administration for the State Department.
Well,
and so
okay.
that just doesn't follow. And so you're saying, well, they did it afterwards. Well, all you can say is that you're just asserting it. And then just like you're just asserting that the Kremlin was involved, you said they're funneling weapons. It's like, okay, well, how do you know that? Is that because the media narrative from the West and NATO says it? Or are you saying, well, I did some interviews and the Ukrainians told me that this was what the truth is. But why would the Ukrainians tell you that the Russians are innocent?
Well,
of course they have a vested bias.
Well,
so your entire thing is based on bias after bias.
Give him a chance to respond, JY. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So I would say that the reason I said there's no evidence is because if somebody makes a claim, it's not on me to disprove it. It's on them to first give evidence for the claim, and then I can examine it and say why it's right, or I'm wrong, or this is what's wrong with your evidence. If I said right now that I believe the CIA picked Trudeau to be the leader of Canada, and you said there's no evidence for that, it's not on you to now present evidence how that didn't happen. It would be on me to present evidence that the CIA overthrew it. And when it comes to what you're talking about, the breaking of the Orthodox Church, that was the agenda of Poroshenko. Poroshenko had 3 pillars. He had one pillar, which was rebuilding of, the Ukrainian identity. There was the other pillar that was the rebuilding of the Ukrainian military. And the third pillar was the separation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And the reason why the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was created, and I think the United States should help with the creation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which, by the way, this happened after the revolution. So it's kind of hard for it to have been part of a color revolution if this thing you're talking about happened after it already happened. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church was created because the Russian Orthodox Church is dominated by the Russian government. If you look at the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, he's telling people right now that if you go to Ukraine and you die fighting for Russia, then you're going to go to heaven. That's one of the fastest tickets to get to heaven. That's not the type of things you say. I think if you're a respectable religious man and you're sending your flock to go over and get slaughtered on behest of a government which keeps you in power, keeps you in that position of influence. We know Kirill's corrupt. We know Kirill is being accused of having multiple affairs with different women that he's tried to cover up. And I think it's perfectly respectable for the Ukrainian people, after Russia invaded and annexed its territory, to separate from an institution that's dominated by the Russians.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, more assertions without evidence. You're just saying
I can give you pictures.
Corrupt. You said, hold on.
Okay.
You said you can give pictures of Kirill paying off women and that he is doing these things. I can Photoshop too. My goodness. The key understanding of this, and I think this is what's being ignored here, is does Russia have a vested geopolitical interest in opposing NATO eastward expansion, which is something NATO promised would never happen. And of course, they break that promise over and over and over again. Now, you can say, well, Ukraine has a right to self-determination. Well, so does Russia. Russia has absolute, the best example you can give is, like, for example, saying Mexico starts to form a very close bond with China. And then they start putting Chinese military bases while China starts making threats towards the United States homeland. We would never tolerate that. And if it got to a boiling point, we'd of course invade. There'd be no question in anybody's mind. So all of this hullabaloo about, oh, Russia's unjustified, or Russia did this, or Russia did that, Russia's corrupt. That's just throwing mud at the wall and hoping something sticks. Right now, you're saying the Moscow Patriarchate is corrupt and very close to the Russian government. That's not out of line with Orthodox teachings, and I don't want to get into an Orthodox debate here. But I would hope that somebody who is making grandiose claims about corruption within the Orthodox Church would at least understand how our church operates. It doesn't seem like you do. As an Orthodox Christian myself, I think that that's a weak argumentation for why Ukraine has a right to oust an elected leader, because he didn't do a campaign promise. If every time someone didn't perform a campaign promise in the United States, we'd have revolutions daily. It's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous stance to hold.
So when it comes to Kirill, it's not even like a secret. I mean, a great example would be, this is just a basic, if you want to say that my photos are photoshopped. If you want to talk about Photoshop, Kirill took a bunch of press photos where he was like reviewing some religious, whatever. It doesn't really matter the specifics, but the photos were taken and he had a Rolex on his arm. And this is as Russia's going through a very economically difficult time. And so what did they do? They edit out the Rolex. This is the type of little things that Kirill and his behavior that people notice. And they say, that's not the type of religious leadership I want. That's not the type of religious leader I want. And I can understand why the Ukrainians would say, I don't want to be led by that man. I want my separate church because we have a different interpretation on how our religious leaders are supposed to act. And religious leaders should not be telling their people to come to my country and kill our soldiers. That's not the type of relationship we want with our church. That's completely understandable. What was the last point you made? I forgot it.
I said that if
it was a tie-in with the Orthodox Church, is what my notes say.
Okay, I forget the specifics, but I'm gonna re-emphasize that there is no evidence that there was a coup during Euromaidan that was organized by the CIA. You said, well, the CIA covers it up. Then I could make up theories about everything on the planet. The CIA did this, the CIA did that. And unless we have physical evidence for it, what we're doing is we're playing pretend and just hoping that we maybe got it right, which isn't the way I want to like engage with foreign policy. That's not the way I'm going to engage whether a CIA organized a coup or didn't organize a coup. There's a million different accusations that are thrown back and forth towards organizations, especially secretive organizations like the Central Intelligence Agency, all the time, which I, of course, am not a part of. And so I'm not just going to accept that explanation unless there's significant evidence provided. And the separation of the Russian church from the Ukrainian church is not evidence of the United States working with protesters to orchestrate a coup. It's evidence of the United States working with Ukraine in its church separation.
Well, there's two things. You don't need to prove a specific instance to show that there was active United States intelligence working with people on the ground, both abroad and in Ukraine. All I had to do was demonstrate that the United States did have active intelligence agents and things of the nature in Ukraine active, which, again, our State Department head admitted under the Trump administration. Trump was by no stretch of the imagination like a anti-Russia. So, again, I think that's dodging the point. I don't want to get hung up on the Russian Orthodox Church. I'd like us to focus on how Russia's geopolitical interests and geopolitical values were constantly being dismissed by eastward expansion of NATO, which is something that NATO promised.
Before we hit that, I do want to say two last things about this before we move on. So it is true that we have CIA agents operating in Ukraine, but again, during the Trump administration, that's after the Revolution of Dignity. That's after the Euromaidan revolution. So us having CIA agents in Ukraine after the revolution does not prove that CIA agents interfered in the revolution during its time. Also, we have CIA agents everywhere. We have CIA agents in Russia, but that doesn't prove that if there was a coup tomorrow, that America orchestrated it. It could be any number of oligarchs that are unsatisfied with Putin's leadership. If there was a coup tomorrow in, I don't know, Chile, we have CIA agents in Chile. We have CIA agents in Australia. We have CIA agents in basically almost every country in the world. I'm just going to be honest, our CIA resources were not strong enough, in my opinion, in Ukraine for us to actually have orchestrated this coup almost certainly on our own. I guess there would have to be more evidence of a more vast conspiracy than that. So for me, I would want more evidence before we disregard what I think is what was the popular will of Ukrainians to overthrow Yanukovych's regime. And when it comes to the idea of like, well, it isn't okay to overthrow your government just because they broke one promise, I would say that the economic situation for Ukrainians can be quite dire. And I understand why they were so angry about the association agreement, but it wasn't because of the association agreement that they overthrew Yanukovych. It was because of what Yanukovych did after the protests started. It was the police abuse. It was the murder of protesters. It was the beating up of women protesters. It was the putting screws and bolts and nails over flash grenades and throwing them into the crowd of protesters. It was the banning of protesting that made the protesters angry. So I don't think the revolution was just because of the association agreement. It was one point, a part of a larger picture, that the Yanukovych regime had mistreated the people of Ukraine, and they had finally said, enough, you're not going to murder our students. If you talk to Euromaidan protesters, for them, the tipping point was when people started to die.
Yeah, so before we move on, I would just, I guess, add one more point to that. I think you admitted that the CIA is active in basically every country on Earth. So all that proves is that, just to add to that small point, is that it takes time for any sort of intelligence to be built up to a degree where you can actually cause a schismatic church of that degree to split off from the legitimate Ukrainian church in Ukraine. So the fact that you say, well, that happened after, it didn't happen that much after. And it's much easier to say, oh, well, they have had assets there for quite a while, building the relationships required to do that. So that's one. Two, you continually talk about how this revolution was legitimate, and we can go into NATO eastward expansion after this, but you keep on saying that these people are justified, but every single point that you make can be made about literally any country on Earth. People break promises. Economic situations become extremely dire, even in the most wealthy countries on Earth. Does that justify that every single time somebody's dissatisfied with their government, that they have a right to trying to overthrow their government? It's ridiculous. Police abuse happens in the United States daily. I'm sure you would agree. And so I don't think that position holds up.
Okay, well, first I would like to say the split of the church, I don't know why this is being brought up as like a CIA point. That had nothing to do with the CIA. The split of the church was done out.
They admitted it.
Out in open. It was done in front of everybody. Poroshenko, it's one of the things he brags about as, hey, that was one of my pillars. It wasn't like organized by the CIA.
Pompeo admits it.
What did he say? What did he say about the split of the
Pompeo
church?
said he worked with allies, including the ecumenical patriarch, to fund and establish schismatic Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The legitimate Orthodox Ukrainian Orthodox Church is still much larger than the schismatic one. It's like twice the size by both clergy and membership.
How did the CIA agents do this?
Well, it's called funding.
Well, what do you mean funding?
You don't establish
the
a
CIA
church
agents gave them money, or did he funnel money from the CIA? I'm just asking, like the detail, like because when you say
no
that,
one knows the details. You're asking for top secret information. Let's be reasonable. If Pompeo admits it, that means that they had the mechanisms in place to cause it. Anyways, I think that we've exhausted that line of questioning.
Okay.
Anyways,
well then I'll answer. I'll answer your second question.
NATO
then.
question next.
What was your well, let me answer your other question, because you asked me a question about, hey, does this type of stuff justify a revolution? In certain instances, yes. I would say in Myanmar, the people who are trying to overthrow the government are 100% justified, and I wish them nothing but good luck, because that government has murdered too many protesters. It isn't like an isolated instance of police abuse here or an isolated instance of police abuse here.
What are the limits?
What are the
Can you give me an objective? Yeah. Well, can you give me an objective standard in which I can put on any country on Earth and say, yep, they're justified in now leaving and causing civil turmoil within the country?
I can't give you an objective standard that is the same to every country on Earth, because every country's on Earth situation is different, and their populations are different, and the cultural norms are different.
So there's no consistency.
Of course there's no consistency. For example, if I went to Ukraine and said, I am going to ban, I don't know, being Muslim, I doubt that would cause a massive revolution outside of maybe Crimea or amongst Tatar communities. If I did that in Iran or Saudi Arabia, that probably will be enough to cause a revolution, because different countries are different. The standards are going to be different.
I wasn't asking about causing a revolution. I'm saying justifying our support, one, for a revolution, and two, justifying the ousting of a legitimate government.
I think banning protest, trying to outlaw protest, is an absolute, after brutalizing protesters and lying about agreements and pulling out, I think that's enough to justify people staying mobilized on the street against the government. And by the way, what was the demand
in the United States ban protests all the time that become violent? So that's a
to ban. They banned protests nationwide.
Yes. Yeah, they broadly, yes, and also the federal government has the authority to do that in the United States. So I feel like your position is kind of hypocritical, because are you advocating
if the United States tried to ban
overthrow
protests,
governors, for example?
If they did try to basically crack down on protests, I do think protesters being violent towards the police is absolutely justifiable. Yes. I think there's been multiple times in American history where police have tried to put down what has been a popular protest, and I think the protesters have been justified in being violent back towards the police. In certain instances, is that the majority of cases? No, but in certain instances, absolutely, particularly during the civil rights era.
Yeah, I find it very unconvincing when you can't give me a standard, but that's fine.
How can I create a universal standard across every country for when we're going to say, okay, now I support it?
You seem to be suggesting that Russia and Ukrainians, etc., crossed a certain line, a certain standard.
I think banning protesters
to this. Okay, so if banning protests are the metric,
it's not.
Lots of countries do that.
It's not that simple. This is.
Are we going to have a revolution every other day?
This is something. I remember when I talked to somebody about like the extradition treaty in Hong Kong, and people were like, "That's a silly thing to get so violent about." And I'm like, "That's not why they're violent. It isn't because of the extradition treaty. It's everything that came before it, and the extradition treaty, and the violence that came after. It wasn't just that it was, protesters got murdered, or just because they pulled out the association agreement, or just because there was all these police abuse and they tried to ban protesting. It was also the corruption. It was also Yanukovych's record in not fulfilling the other promises that he had said he was going to do. It was a culmination of Ukrainian society rejecting Yanukovych because he didn't fulfill his promises. He was a liar. He brutalized protesters and then tried to stop those from even who were going out against him from being even allowed to do them. He paid hired thugs into Tutushki to go out and stab protesters.
This is great narrative.
Taking literal narrative. This isn't narrative. This is what happened.
Yes, no Ukrainian as of 2022, when you went there and you started interviewing people, is going to admit that Yanukovych did nothing wrong. They're going to exaggerate things that happen, just like
what do you mean?
Media does here.
I'm not exaggerating anything.
Like they called the January 6th protesters revolutionaries.
What did I exaggerate?
You know,
what did I exaggerate?
I'm saying, well, what do you mean? What did you exaggerate?
Yeah, you said, you're going to exaggerate. I'm giving you specific Tutushki thugs that the government paid to go out and stab and murder protesters.
You made 3 claims within that one statement, and you didn't provide anything that suggests otherwise, other than say, well, a Ukrainian told me. Well, this is I didn't say a Ukrainian told me. Do you want me to give you police reports? I give you investigations.
All right. I like having a little bit of blood sports too, right? But we got to back it up because it's becoming so incoherent. We can't understand what each side is saying. So back up just for a second. We're going to start with Burns. Burns, go ahead.
So when you say, it's a Ukrainian, what I'm saying to you is like the Civil War happened. It's like, I'm just saying a historical event. I'm not making a claim that can be disproven because there's film, there's photographs, there's multiple dead bodies, and there's multiple investigations into it that have been done post the fact, multiple documentaries, by who? By a whole host of different journalists and NGOs. Like, do you want me to give you a specific report about this happening?
NGOs from the West and NGOs from Ukraine and Ukrainian authorities don't have a bias against Russia, for example?
They don't. Their bias doesn't matter if the evidence is heavy enough. Just like if Russia presented heavy enough evidence about, say, biochemical weapons, then I would have to say, okay, well, what do you think of the Tutushki?
It doesn't matter what I think of Tutushki. I'm asking for his consistent standard.
I'm asking because
I still haven't gotten an answer.
Let me please answer my question.
Like
I want to know the answer though, because the reason
I don't have a strong opinion on Tutushki. There's your answer. Now we can.
How can you not have a strong opinion on Tutushki? Why not?
Because I don't think it's as relevant as I don't think it's as relevant as the wider geopolitical implications of why Russia felt the need to get in the first place. We're arguing nuance and little finite details of the Ukrainian quote unquote revolution, as you called it. But what I'm asking is, because of all this destabilization, because of the buildup of the Ukrainian armed forces, and because of all these other things, does Russia have a legitimate geopolitical interest in intervening in the Ukraine? And my position from the beginning was yes. And I gave several, like NATO westward expansion, which they promised would never happen. And then we'll go into all these other details, which is what I was hoping we could get into, rather than these minutia details about the intricacies of Ukrainian corrupt politics, which, by the way, every single Western journalist for the last 20 years up until the war in Ukraine started admitted Ukraine was one of the most corrupt countries on earth.
Why would you
even
trust
under
Western,
Zelensky.
Western bias like that?
I'm saying that
Anti-Ukrainian
they
Western
have a bias. They have a pro-Ukrainian bias, but even they admit that it was an extremely corrupt
So you would
regime, even
say,
under Zelensky.
do you have evidence of the corruption?
I'm not saying that Ukraine is corrupt. I'm saying that your own people that are pro-Ukrainian admitted that it was one of the most corrupt nations on earth. It's the human trafficking. It was the human trafficking capital of the world prior to the invasion in Ukraine.
Do you think that high level of corruption might be a motivating factor for why people would go out into the street and say we need to change things, on top of the violence, on top of everything else that happened? If you're admitting yourself and you're agreeing that the state of Ukraine is not exactly perfect, there's a lot of reasons why people would go out to the street and fight outside. That's all I need to establish.
But they said that there's a lot of reasons that this would happen too, though.
Yeah, of course.
They didn't just say this.
Ukraine's gotten better, but it isn't perfect.
Has it?
Yes, it absolutely has. I would say.
You think so?
Yes, I can give you multiple examples if you want me to.
It's okay. Under Zelensky.
Yes.
Under Zelensky, it was the
and
human
Poroshenko.
trafficking capital of the world. Surrogate mother, where they sell women's bodies because women couldn't afford to feed themselves, so they have to sell their bodies to provide babies to Hollywood elites back in the West.
This all applies to Russia as well, by the way, just to be clear.
But Russia actively tries to stop it. There's
so does
a difference.
Ukraine.
Zelensky didn't do any of that. I think name me a policy that Zelensky did and enacted that tried to stop the surrogate mother boom, which is one of the biggest money drivers for Ukraine prior to the war.
Name a specific. Can you name one for Putin? I just want to make sure if you're applying this policy.
Yeah, Putin, for example, just passed legislation today or 2 days ago, promoting traditional values for religious values, which would, by definition,
what does that even
oppose
mean?
Sex work, surrogacy, things like that. In fact, he also passed a law back in 2013 and 2012, I can't remember, banning foreign people adopting Russian children. Why? Because a lot of people were selling their kids to the United States. That is a net detriment, and that's a horrible practice. And he stopped that. So I mean, you can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, Zelensky
let him respond, JY.
So yeah.
Okay, so I don't think promoting traditional values, and like as a law, I don't even know, like, did he say like don't be a whore? Like what did he say when you say he passed a law to promote traditional values? How does it promote traditional values that like counters like sex, like in this
well promoting the traditional family unit, which by any metrics, if you look at any country on earth, when more people are married and stay married and have children within marriage, rates of crime, rates of human trafficking, and all these things go down immensely. Drug use, all that stuff. And actually,
how does he promote it though? Does he just say do it? Because like that's not really.
Well, no, he enforces laws that encourage people to stay married.
How? Like what law? Because like promoting, like I can come out and say I promote.
So I gave you.
Well, no, the reason I'm asking is I can come out and I could say I promote traditional values, be married or whatever. That doesn't do anything. Like what is it like do? Because like if I said to combat the MS-13 rape problem, my solution is stay married. Like that isn't really a solution.
Yeah, I don't think that those are equivalent. Again, Putin, for example, in Russia, promotes traditional values through all sorts of ways. They give mothers who have more than like 2 children, they give them huge amount of benefits for motherhood within marriage. It's similar policies to what Orban has been doing in Hungary. And those have been working fairly well for Hungary. But I don't think you answer, well, let me ask you this. What policy has Zelensky put in place prior to the war that stopped the mass amounts of surrogacy that was happening within Russia, where women were Ukraine, where women were required to sell their bodies?
Why does it have to be before the war?
Well, because the war obviously causes any sort of analysis of current criminal crime trends kind of moot, because no one can do a proper analysis of all of Ukraine when there's active conflicts and a lot of people fleeing.
Okay, well, I don't know of any specific policy that Zelensky did to combat this specific issue. It's not something I've done research in. What I will say is that I think Ukraine has vastly improved as a country in the last 8 years. I would point to things like non-discrimination protections. I would point to the abolishment of the Berkut, which was an institution that shouldn't have existed at all. That riot police was engaged in deep things like racketeering. That's something that Poroshenko did to try to combat corruption, was get rid of the Berkut, was engaged in racketeering, was engaged in torture, was engaged in abuse of civilians. That was just one thing that they did. There were other things that they did, but as you've said multiple times, you want to get into the bigger geopolitical question. And so I don't want to stay into the nuance anymore.
Yeah.
So I want to get into the bigger geopolitical question about Russia's strategic interests in Ukraine. So what is your specific question?
So, so when Russia gave a very clear red line in the sand to NATO about lines that they will not allow NATO to cross, why is it acceptable for them to then encourage countries to continue to join NATO and actively pursue their membership when they offer no significant strategic benefit other than to box in Russia and to threaten Russia's capital, frankly? What strategic interest does NATO have in, for example, Latvia?
What strategic interest? It's a collective.
Yeah, why are they continually?
It's a collective defense agreement, and so the idea behind
what you're asking, collective defense implies that Latvia can offer something to the United States. What can Latvia offer the United States other than the fact that the United States can now put troops on the border with Russia, which threatens Russia directly?
I would say that's a good thing that we can put troops on the border with Russia, but I would also say because I don't trust Russia, and But
why would you risk nuclear conflict?
Because I'm willing to.
You're willing to?
Yeah, I think the risk of nuclear war is quite low. Yes.
Okay, I want as low of risk as possible, next to zero. But you're willing to risk a low probability?
I'm not a pushover, right? Because if the idea is like, what's the lowest risk possible? Then it's like, okay, well, let's withdraw from all of Europe, and maybe we should give up Guam because maybe Guam's threatening to the Chinese, and maybe we should, but like at some point, like you got to put a line and say, would you oppose Chinese and Russian bases in Mexico and Canada? I would oppose it, but I wouldn't invade Mexico.
What if Mexico started being belligerent on the southern border and taking territory?
If they tried to invade America and take our territory, then obviously that's a different situation.
No, being belligerent. They don't necessarily need to. Belligerent means like shelling U.S. citizens, harming U.S. citizens as they travel through Mexico, becoming such a dystopic nightmare that they have to actually intervene, which is something, frankly, from my position, there is no problem with America invading because I think that Russia has every right to guard its geopolitical interests.
So
ultimately, that's the case
thing is, I don't care about Russia's geopolitical interests.
Okay, well then why do they care about your
argument? You gotta let, if you ask me a question and I'm trying to answer it, I gotta explain my position. Because if I just say there's a low risk of nuclear war, I gotta expand on that because people are just gonna think I'm a psychopath, right? So the reason why I don't care is because I'm not a realist. I don't believe in realism. I'm also not like a hardcore like Henry Kissinger, like we got to balance the world and find a way to have all these poles that are balancing off each other. I believe very fundamentally that the West, when it comes to at least our democracy, is the best. I believe we have the better values. I believe we have better ways of going about ourselves. We have a higher standard of living. We have stronger economies. Russia's economy is smaller than California's economy. And I think the way we have conducted ourselves has been better for us generally. Now, I don't want to go around and force everybody else to do that. But if somebody wants to join our system, I think that's perfectly fine. And I understand why they want to join our system. The European Union is generally very prosperous. It has a very high standard of living, and nations that join the European Union seem to see their standard of living go up. And so it's not that crazy that Ukrainians want to join the EU overwhelmingly, want to join NATO overwhelmingly, want to go with the West overwhelmingly, when their relationship with Russia has historically been pretty abusive, like the banning of the Ukrainian language. And so me wanting the Ukrainians to have the best case scenario for their long-term prosperity, which would be with the West almost undeniably at this point, I think is perfectly fine, and I'm willing to support them in that effort.
Yeah, so basically what you said is my position good because it's good, Russia's position bad because I don't like Russia. That's basically what you ended up
I'm
saying.
saying
However,
that our citizens have higher standards of living because the way Russia has gone about things is worse. You can look at the results.
That's very, very debatable. That gets into economics, and I don't want to go delve into the silly nuance of that.
You don't need to delve into the nuance to say that the Western economies are stronger than the Russian economy.
It's stronger in depending on how you define a strong economy. I wouldn't say that
it's larger, has more access to resources.
Larger means nothing. If the United States were to get cut off from China tomorrow, for example, we'd completely collapse.
What about a higher standard of living?
If Russia gets cut off from China, Russia will be, for the most part, relatively similar to what they have right now, which it isn't, and I will admit, isn't as luxurious as Western nations, but they actually have an internal economy that's cohesive and is able to sustain itself. The West does not.
It's not sustainable. I disagree. Russia's economy has shown itself to be much weaker than anybody ever.
What are you talking about? They're sanctioned by half the world, and they're able to.
And their economy is in shambles. It's in shambles.
The ruble is stronger now. No, could just look at the ruble. The ruble is stronger now than it was pre-war.
And you can't trade it on international markets, so it doesn't matter. Who
cares? No, they can trade it with the second largest economy and the third largest economy in the world, India and China.
What is the ruble's price on black markets?
Doesn't matter what its price is.
That is important. I can tell you why it's important.
What matters about a ruble or any currency is how much your people can have to use in order to buy basic necessities. The Russians can buy their basic necessities, no problem. The average Russian civilian can get food on the table. They can get gas on the table, something that Western Europe can't do right now. They have geopolitical trade relationships with numerous countries with BRICS. BRICS is a prime example of one of the largest 50% of the world is essentially under BRICS, and they just announced Saudi Arabia wants to join. That's a domino, my friend. That means that the Western homogeny is very weak, and it doesn't have the sustainment or the power to sustain itself that it did before. Russia's playing its cards right here.
Andrew, when do I get to talk? Okay, so I just want to quickly say the Russian ruble is artificially inflated, and they're not allowing it to trade with many international markets because no international markets also would accept it because of its poor value. If you look at the black market, which is a much better way to look at how much the ruble's actually worth when you take away all the restrictions because the government interfered, they're trying to prop it up, it's dog cheap. It's very, very cheap. And we don't even need to stay on the ruble. If you disagree with me with that, that's fine. We can look at a 60% reduction in construction GDP. We can look at 40% of their airlines being grounded because of their airline planes have to take parts out of one plane and transfer it into another plane for it to work. We're seeing car manufacturers, we're seeing car sales plummet and car manufacturer GDP plummet. I think it was we saw car sales plummet by 88%. The economy is not doing well. Foreign exchange reserves, half of it's gone, half of it's frozen, and they're running out of it quite quickly. The Russian economy is not in as good of a shape as the Russian government wants you to believe to project strength. It is not in a fantastic position. If it was in a great position, if they're doing fine, then they wouldn't care about the sanctions. Because like you said, hey, Europe, they're scared of all the gas. If this was fine, if everything was fine in Russia, why wouldn't he just say, well, this is great. I can just basically freeze out the Europeans. I'll just sit here. I don't even want sanctions relief. Yeah, sanction me. Kill yourselves. Because that's if it's true that Russia's economy is fine and it's the Europeans who are scrambling, why does he constantly want to get rid of these sanctions? We've seen him ask multiple times, hey, let's negotiate, get rid of these sanctions, and he's constantly reaching out to try to end this because he knows the Russian economy can't sustain in its current condition.
That's a ridiculous assumption on your part. The Russian economy has been sanctioned since 2014. It's been fine. It's been relatively stable. the entire time. The ruble has been the same amount. You can say that it's been inflated and the government's propping it up, no more than the U.S. dollar. So I don't think that's in. And frankly,
we can
you keep on appealing
the US
to
dollar in international
you keep on
markets.
appealing to black markets, but black markets, you're assuming I'm going to grant you and be charitable and say that you have intimate knowledge with the black market, Dylan, but somehow I doubt that. So
Okay.
I'm just going to let that one slide. So here's the reality about the situation in Russia. The situation in Russia is they can afford gas. The average civilian can afford food to put it on the table. They don't need a large trade imbalance to be able to provide the basic necessities for the people. A lot of the things you brought up, like the fact that car manufacturers have gone down, is because a lot of car manufacturers are banned from even selling their stuff in Russia. However, what has Russia done? They've opened up their own Russian branded plants. Well, what does that mean? Jobs for Russians. So again, jobs matter more than you trading billions of dollars into a country where your people will never see the product of. Luxury goods don't matter. The only thing Italy provides Russia is luxury goods, so I don't buy this idea that Russia is going to be in shambles. The reason Putin is also asking for sanctions to be lifted is because they're ridiculous, because he doesn't want to have to put himself in conflict with the rest of the world if he doesn't need to, but he's perfectly willing to, as we have seen him. He's perfectly willing to. He's been perfectly willing to since 2014 when they've only sanctioned him slightly more than they've been since 2014. It's not that much worse, frankly. And actually, a lot of countries, especially the biggest economies in the world, like I mentioned, have not sanctioned Russia. Brazil, India, China, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, all these countries have not sanctioned Russia, and 12 more have announced they want to join BRICS. So as far as I'm concerned, Russia's in a position of strength while U.S. is quickly losing major partners like India.
So the cars that are being made in Russia are shit. They don't have seat belts. They had to use foreign components before because Russia just didn't have the technology in order to produce cars after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so they had to rely on foreign imports. That's why car sales have plummeted by 88%. Not only because they're not being able to import foreign cars anymore, and they have to use local components that are making the cars less safe and of a lower quality and much more expensive, but it's also because average Russians just have less money in their wallet at the end of the day. Over 1,100 companies have left Russia and or have curtailed their business in it, making up 40% of the country's GDP. That is $600 billion. $600 billion. You have hundreds of thousands of Russians fleeing Russia. They don't want anything to do with it. It's like the Cold War all over again, where you're seeing Germans trying to jump over the wall because they want nothing to do with East Germany. They want nothing to do with the economic ruins that East Germany was during the Cold War. And Russians don't want anything to do with the economic ruin that Russia has put itself in now, which has only been worsened by mobilization, as we're seeing hundreds of thousands of Russians flood over the Georgian border. And how does Russia respond to this? By putting military recruiters on the border to try to scare them back in. They have to chase people throughout their community trying to get them to go fight this war. The economy is not doing as good as the Russian government would want you to. The reason why Putin wants these sanctions lifted is because the sanctions is putting pressure on his regime, and it's making it harder for him not only to produce cars and vehicles and keep his airlines and railways and roads working, but also to sustain the war, because a lot of the missiles that they're using need to be relying on foreign components. That's why you're seeing him relying on Iranian drones more and more, because he can't make up for their stockpiles.
Well, that's just blatantly untrue. Any military analysis who works in logistics knows that Russia can produce 100 times more in a single month than the United States can produce in a year in terms of stockpiles. So Russia's not going to run out of artillery or of munitions anytime
They're going to
soon.
run out of long-range, high-precision missiles, which are necessary for them to disrupt Ukraine's logistical grid. And yes, they will. They've already reduced the use of these missiles to a massive capacity.
That's getting bogged down into the details of a war in which I don't think either of us are absolute experts in, but I do know people who are experts in it, and they all say universally that the Russians are not going to lose this war, one, and two, they're saying that the Russians have the ability to sustain this war indefinitely compared to Ukraine.
They don't.
The United States has already depleted its stockpile. NATO is already depleting its stockpile. Our own generals have admitted this. We have to rebuild our stockpile from the ground up. Ukraine doesn't have anything more to offer. What they're doing is they're shedding the blood of young men for a pointless endeavor when they could come to the negotiating table early on, but instead it was sabotaged by NATO. Again, because NATO would rather sacrifice the lives of young Ukrainian men than capitulate to Russia, China, and these other countries who don't support U.S. NATO homogeny on the world stage.
Over 500,000 to 1 million Russians have fled the country, a country which demographics were already in the
Assertion
shitter,
without evidence.
going down.
But okay.
What do you mean assertion without evidence? Look at the fucking border; they're flooding over. What do you mean? Look,
A
use
few
your
pictures
eyes.
of people
I'm
leaving
not-
the country
I'm
is
not-
not evidence.
This, I mean, do you? I can. Do you want me
Do
to?
you
send
have like objective stats from like say Kazakhstan?
What about
Georgia,
Yale?
Saying,
Do
this
you
is how
like
many...
Yale? Is Yale an institution you would respect when it comes to their?
No.
Okay,
I don't
well
trust Western institutions to tell the truth about a geopolitical foe.
Well,
They
the
have,
thing
they have an
is,
obvious bias.
whether or not you think the institution of Yale has an anti-Russian bias that's going to make them
course they
inflate
do.
numbers, okay, how does
Dude,
that
they were
present?
part of the problem, dude. They were the ones, Yale and their professors.
Do you have a problem with
supported the
educational
Russian-
institutions generally, or just Western ones? But you trust the Eastern ones to analyze Russia, though. The Eastern ones, you
Well,
can
I
trust
think
them.
I think, for example, Modi, who is a relatively independent person who was much more closely aligned to the United States until recently, and now is much closer with China
So
and
Indian
Russia.
schools, I'd have to find you like an Indian school or an Indian
Well,
study.
the
since
Indian
photos
Prime
and
Minister
videos
doesn't
don't
seem
work.
to agree with your analysis of Russia's economy. They don't seem to, and neither does the IMF.
What do you
the
mean?
International Bank, they upgraded Russia's economy compared to all the rest of the
Well,
world.
the
which they
Russians don't seem
downgraded.
to agree with it because they're running away. They're leaving.
Well, again, assertion without evidence.
I mean, there
but-
is evidence. I'm actively saying here's evidence, and you're just rejecting it because it's Yale. Yale is one of the
Yeah.
most prestigious educational institutions in the world.
Yeah, all I'm saying is that I can give you biased evidence that the Russians are saying that, hey, not that many people have left, and then you'll say, well, my Western institutions say that a lot of people have left, so it's a moot point. So what I'm asking you for, and again, you've dodged the point again.
What's the point?
I've been trying to make the point that NATO is the primary causer of this conflict, and I've made the point several times
Okay.
throughout this debate.
So I can respond to that quickly, but I want to respond to something earlier you said. Russia is not in a good state when it comes to this war. I don't think it even takes me much mentioning their retreat from Kharkiv. They're retreating now from Kherson. They're getting slaughtered there as they're trying to cross the river. They had to retreat from Kiev. They had to retreat from Lyman. They actually got slaughtered at Lyman. I mean, I think in 1 month, Russia has lost. I think it was they lost how much? Like the territory the size of Montenegro. They keep losing territory. This war was not supposed to last this long. Everyone knows it wasn't supposed to last this long. It was supposed to be a special military operation with no mobilization needed. Mobilization was supposed to change. This is going to be the big thing to help Russia. And they mobilize. And what are they doing now? They're retreating from Kherson. They're running away with their tail behind their legs. Because Russia was a paper tiger when it comes to the state of their military. It was too corrupt. It was too inept. And now they're relying on untrained labor, giving them machine guns, maybe a week of training max, sending them to the front line before they get obliterated. They
That's
are
just
not
utterly false.
they
Everything you
cannot-
said there
I wasn't
is
done.
so
I wasn't
utterly
done.
false.
I don't think
Yeah,
I'm-
let him finish. Let him finish, Jay.
I wasn't done. Now you can say it's false, but what I've just realized
it
what
is.
this is a post-truth debate. This is a debate where it's going to be, you're going to take Russian sources and say, this is what the Russians say. And I'm going to take my sources from Yale or my evil Western sources. I'm going to take video from the border of Russians trying to cross into Georgia. Or I can look at the immigration data in Georgia. Or I can look at the immigration data in Turkey. I can look at the immigration data on these border states from all across the board and see hundreds of thousands of new Russians going into Georgia. Where do you think they came from? Did they just appear out of nowhere? Or do you think the Georgians are in on it and they're lying about the immigration data? Do you think the Turks are in on it? Are they lying about the immigration data? Are the Kazakhs lying about the immigration data? The Kazakhs are in Russia's alliance, for God's sake. They have no reason to lie about the immigration data.
Well, you're more than welcome to provide the data later. But what I'm trying to say is, first off, I could tell that you have never been in. Well, either you've been in the military and you didn't pay attention, or you've never been involved with military people at all. Because Russia's geopolitical interests Russia's interest in this conflict was never territory grabbing. If you're talking about territory grabbing, then Napoleon was the greatest success ever, even though he ended up losing all the territory he gained. Territory doesn't matter if you ultimately lose. And so the point is Russia is very casualty adverse, meaning they're going to try their best to avoid as many casualties on their end while inflicting maximum casualties on the Ukrainian end. And the reason they're doing that is because their stated goal from the onset of the special military operation, as it was called early on, was what? To demilitarize Ukraine and disable their ability to amass a significant amount of forces. The only reason Ukraine is on any legs at all is because of Western volunteers under the guise of volunteers when they're really just NATO soldiers being sent there.
Wait, what? What do you mean?
I mean? Anyone with two brain cells rubbing them together knows
people.
That's what's
They're
happening.
volunteers. They're not NATO soldiers.
I don't care. Of course they're going to tell you that. Who's going to tell you that, hey, I was actually sent here by
this is a massive operation.
NATO.
If somehow NATO soldiers have saved it, there has to be some evidence, like NATO documents.
Yeah, billions of dollars that just vanished into thin air when they got sent. Only about, 10% actually made it to the front lines.
That's not true. That's not true.
That was reported even by the New York Times and New York Post and all these Western biased sources.
No, they didn't.
That. Yes, they
I know the story you're talking about.
They had
to retract it. They had to retract it.
No, they retracted it out of pressure from the United States.
Let him respond, JY. Let him respond.
They retracted it because the information that they presented was dishonest. They made it sound like the military aid wasn't getting to the front line, when what was really being talked about, when the statistic, and by the way, it wasn't 10%, it was like 40%. The reason why was because it was humanitarian aid of a single organization being talked about by somebody who worked with that organization. They weren't talking about military aid in that documentary. They retracted it because they had to admit that their framing of it made it look like that American military aid was going to Ukraine and just disappearing. That isn't happening. There's no evidence so far of massive amounts of American military aid disappearing. There's, of course, the odd instance of like one box of grenades or one box of AKs that disappear and anything, but that's always in the margin of error. So my question is, what evidence do you have that A, that NATO soldiers are currently deployed in Ukraine fighting on the front lines as NATO troops, that these foreign volunteers that I've met tricked me and they're actually NATO soldiers, and B, what is the evidence that the majority of the military aid that being sent isn't making it to the front?
Yeah, so I gave the evidence already. You just didn't like it, and then you claimed that you debunked
the person you're citing retracted it. The person you're citing doesn't agree with you.
You gotta let JY answer to what you just asked him, Dylan. Go ahead, JY.
So the how you know that these people are not telling the truth is because multiple sources reported on it, and then out of pressure from Western governments, they retract it. And why would Western governments be interested in retracting that if they didn't have a vested interest or have stakes in those places? Of course, they're not going to admit that they're sending or encouraging people to go in there and volunteer. But everyone knows that NATO is directly involved in this conflict. That's why they're sending billions of dollars. They have an invested interest. That's why there was a conflict that happened between volunteers and Ukrainians. Even the Ukrainian military admitted to this. So all of this stuff is just your obvious bias because you went there, you got a couple sorry sap stories from some people on the front lines, and now you feel heartbroken over this. And so you believe anything they would tell you. You're bleeding heart, and that's fine. But at least admit you're a bleeding heart. And further, I didn't finish my point earlier about the territory. Their goal is to diminish the Ukrainian armed forces. They succeeded partially through defeating the Azov battalion, something that didn't exist. The neo-Nazis didn't exist. Swear they didn't, and then of course everyone admits they exist later on. But it's not a bad thing that they exist. So this is all coping, in my opinion. You're not actually giving anything other than my source that I went to Ukraine, and therefore what I said is true. Okay.
So you didn't provide me with any evidence to what I just said. I asked you, how do you know that these volunteers, because volunteers exist. I know there was volunteers who went to Spain. There was volunteers who went to the American Civil War. People of their own fruition, for whatever reason, the ideological agreement or whatever, they go. I know that's true because I went. And I know other people who went. And so I would be very shocked if while I was meeting and seeing with all these people and like somehow they tricked me, and not only did they trick me, they tricked the international press, they tricked international monitors, they tricked NGOs, they tricked Interpol, who should be able to monitor this stuff, they tricked everybody, and there's no evidence to provide it, but we should believe it because we know that America supports Ukraine, so we just need to assume they're NATO soldiers. We just need to fill in the blanks with whatever nonsense we make up in our head about it being NATO soldiers to cope for the fact that Russia's military is incompetent, they're pathetic, they're unorganized, they're corrupt, they lost 1.5 million fucking uniforms, winter uniforms. They can't even properly gear up their soldiers. And you don't even need to ask me. Ask the average Russian soldier. You see tons of videos coming out from Russia of them like, look at this rusty AK. This shit doesn't work. Oh, I have to get in this T-62 from the Cold War. This shit doesn't work. The main turret doesn't work. You have so many soldiers.
This is your argument?
You can laugh.
This is pathetic, dude.
You can laugh all you want. But the problem is, I'm not done, Lewis. I'm not done. We still use old equipment. We don't use it in a frontline struggle for our survival at the throwing on. If you just look at the American invasion of Iraq, it took 28 days. 255 later, Russia still hasn't taken all the Donbass. They're retreating from Kherson. They retreated from Kharkiv. They retreated from Lyman. They retreated from Kiev, and the war is still going on. They've mobilized. They still haven't captured all the territory that they wanted to capture. And if the goal is to demilitarize Ukraine, Ukraine's more powerful now than they were before the war. They're filled with Western supplied weapons like the HIMARS. They still don't even have air superiority, the Russians. That's pathetic. The fact that Russia, who was supposed to have one of the most powerful air forces on the planet, can't get air superiority over Ukraine, a country 1/10 its size, with a minuscule air force that they supposedly disabled on the first day of the invasion. Come on.
You're an idiot. Just straight up, you're not smart. Any military analyst would laugh and scoff at what you just said, because none of it is actually in their military.
Everything I just said isn't even disputable.
No, yeah, it is.
What
absolutely.
part? Say the specific. Say it. What's the specific?
I'm trying to get into my response to your
say the specific thing that's wrong, because everything I just said just happened.
Let him answer.
All you're doing is this is just argument from incredulity. All I'm saying is that you are saying that Russia's not able to have air superiority. Well, then why are their drones hitting literally every part of Ukraine with little resistance if the Ukrainians have such amazing missile defense? They're not trying to level the country like we did with Iraq. Remember what the United States did to Iraq? We leveled the entire country, millions dead. The Russians have been
millions. Wow.
Yes, millions, and that's by true, independent
Western sources. Oh, you trust them now when they're against America.
The argument that you're making is saying, well, the Russians haven't completely leveled Kiev, and therefore, of course, the Russians aren't going to level Kiev. They have a vested interest in not leveling it. And also, furthermore, they have been casualty adverse to civilians and their own military. So they are slow rolling. It's a meat grinder. Everyone knows that you go into the front lines of Ukraine, about 40% of your unit doesn't come back. And that is absolutely true. The Ukrainians themselves admit it. They admit it. Ukraine would not be running out of blood bags in the front line if they weren't having mass amounts of casualties on these stupid offenses that gain nothing but empty farmland. So give me a freaking break with this Russia's incompetent. Well, then why is Ukraine struggling and ousting if they're so incompetent with Western-backed military guy? I can just flip the conversation right back at you. It's a silly argument. Coming from somebody who obviously knows nothing about military conflict.
Okay. Let him respond now, JY. Go ahead, Dylan.
So, Lewis, you're part of a class of clowns. The Gonzo Liras, the people who pretend to know what they're talking about, but all they do is regurgitate state media talking points. I didn't regurgitate state media talking points. I gave you studies from Yale. But because it has Western influence, it's disregarded. And we're going to have this, we're just going to bump heads for the rest of it. But if you want to get into throwing insults back and forth, we can do that. I would prefer not to. I can get heated, but let's probably not insult each other. So when it comes to the specifics of the Russian military, whether or not you call the city of Kherson empty farmland, as the Russians are abandoning it right now, whether you're going to call Lyman empty farmland, if you're going to take all the land that they took back around Kharkiv empty farmland, or the rivers they took back, or Kupiansk empty farmland, I would disagree with that classification. I would also disagree that the Russians have air superiority is your position, that because they can have, I think 40 to 30% of the drones they end up launching hit their targets in places like Kiev, or the deeper it goes, of course, the more it gets shot down. Because they can do that, they have air superiority. The air superiority isn't that you hit 30% of the targets you shoot at. Air superiority isn't that 80% of our stuff gets shot down when we try to hit a target. Air superiority is that you have nobody to contradict you. You don't have an air force to contradict you. You don't have, you know, the weapons on the ground to air defense system that's going to take you out. That's what America worked to establish during the invasion of Iraq, and Russia has failed to establish during the invasion of Ukraine.
You're comparing Iraq to Ukraine, which is why you're not a serious interlocutor.
I'm just saying that America has shown itself to be an effective military, and the Russians
No, it hasn't. Why did it take 20 years for us to build up Iraq and Afghanistan, and now they're both collapsing?
How was Iraq
within a matter of days?
How did Iraq collapse?
Iraq collapsed after we withdrew.
I don't give a shit about Iraq. I don't care about Afghanistan. Tie it back into the topic at hand, or say nothing about it. Go ahead.
Well, actually, let's move on, because there's not going to get anywhere with talking about military stuff, because clearly you have your sources, I have mine, and no one's going to agree about who is actually winning this conflict. I think that if you look at the objective analysis, you'd see Russia is going to win, and it's going to be a bloodbath for Ukraine.
It's a glorious retreat, a glorious, victorious retreat.
Anyways, the reason Afghanistan and Iraq are relevant is because what it demonstrates is the dual standard that NATO has in regards to the conflict in Ukraine. Russia is not allowed to defend its geopolitical interests, but a country that has no interest with the United States, and we know this now because of the lies about the WMDs and the likes, were invaded. And not just those countries, but Syria, who never invited the United States to be within their own territory, but did invite Russia. All of these things are ignored by these Western sycophants because they would prefer to just pretend that the Ukrainians are this glorious rebellion trying to fight back the evil empire, because it's like movie to them. They actually don't care about the lives being spent. They would rather have all these Ukrainian young men be just slaughtered in a meat grinder than actually come to a conclusion that, you know what, Ukraine's going to lose. They need to give up some territory. But unfortunately, because of Western-backed media and the NATO sycophants supporters, we're going to see more and more young people die because of this. That's what's sad about this whole thing.
So me saying that Russia's invasion is bad does not need to be predicated on whatever America has ever done internationally is correct, or whatever NATO has done internationally is correct. I'm sure I can find something that you think Russia did that is bad. I'm sure I could find something. And that wouldn't be bad. It wouldn't mean that now you can't support Russia in this invasion. So I can call out the invasion of Iraq. I don't think we should have invaded Iraq. I also don't think we should support the Saudis in Yemen. I do think we should have been involved in Syria, and I wish Bashar al-Assad would be removed from power. I think he's a bad guy. I think he's disgusting. And we did the majority of the fighting against ISIS. He didn't. So we actually helped his country from ISIS while he was too busy shooting rebels and barrel bombing civilians. Now
you gotta tie this back into Russia.
I know, but he brought it back up. So I had to. I'll bring it back over there. I'll bring it back over to Russia. Now, I don't really care that much about debating the invasion of Iraq and Syria that much. What I do care about is that last thing you said, and I hear this a lot. It's the idea of, like, it's this premise of, what is it? America will fight to the last Ukrainian. That Americans don't care, and the American government doesn't care about the average Ukrainian civilian, and so they're the ones throwing Ukrainians into the meat grinder. But if you go to Ukrainians and you talk to them about why they're fighting, they're not going to say to uphold NATO's strategic interests in the age of the coming age of multipolarity. What they're going to say is, look, the Russians bombed my mother. They killed her. Or, hey, the Russians backed Yanukovych, and the Yanukovych killed a protester friend of mine or injured me during the protest. Or, hey, you know, the Russian annexed Crimea, and a Tartar friend of mine, he ended up dead in a river because of that. All right. Russia banned our language historically during the Russian Tsardom, and I would like for the Ukrainian language to prosper. Or, hey, you know what? I don't like that Russia has killed countless Ukrainian civilians during their bombing campaigns, or countless Ukrainian people during their bombing campaigns. They want to liberate their land. And this isn't like a question of like, oh, is that their opinion? That is their opinion. All polling data seems to suggest, and there seems to be no evidence to the contrary, that the Ukrainians want the Russians out. They want them to leave, they want them out of their country, and then they want to run their own affairs the way they want to. And so when somebody says the West, the heartless West, evil imperialist America is going to fight to the end of the last Ukrainian, the Ukrainians are the ones who are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. So we are just backing up what they want to do.
Okay, so again, I don't think you actually answered the question of hypocrisy here, because I think you just admitted it. I don't think I have to make any more arguments.
I'm not.
You admitted you have no problem. You have no problem with intervention of NATO in other places, like, for example, Kosovo and places like that. But then you
Didn't even
clutch
ask my
pearls.
opinion about it.
You clutch pearls about Ukraine and Russia. And then the fact of the matter is NATO has been a objective force for evil because they're the ones that ultimately caused this war to take place. They're the ones that refuse to allow Turkey to intervene and for Turkey to get involved and actually go into this. International law and everything else, Russia has strictly adhered to in terms of war and conflict. It's hard for you to admit this because, again, you have a bias. You talk to a couple sorry sap stories in the front lines who, of course, are going to tell you the woes of evil of Russians. Oh, they ate babies. That's why they call them orcs. Like, they're such over-dramatizing little babies, which is why NAFO is a prime example of these disinformation campaign, which you're a part of, by the way, because you actually use their symbology and all the time on your social media account. So the point is that I don't believe that you're actually honestly assessing this conflict because you have a impassioned bias towards Ukraine because you went there, you heard some stories, and so instead of actually addressing the geopolitical interests of Russia and saying, oh, I don't care about the geopolitical interests, okay, then why do I care about anything about Ukraine's geopolitical interests or NATO's who support Ukraine?
So
you haven't convinced anybody of that.
Okay. So the first thing is, I can say the United States is hypocritical and say also in the same breath, Russia shouldn't have invaded Ukraine. Right? I don't think state actors are these uniquely good things that are just looking out for the best of every other nation involved. I think states are pretty selfish, you know? Mearsheimer, who I'm sure somebody you respect, somebody talks about this all the time, you know, the selfishness of states and acting in their own self-interest. It's a basic tenet of realism. And that's the one tenet of realism I do agree with, that states are selfish. But that acknowledgement of America being historically hypocritical when it comes to saying one thing and doing another does not mean I need to endorse the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Because the thing is, you say NATO is the one who caused this invasion. It was the Russians who in 2014 accepted Yanukovych as he fled where a revolution that was trying to hold him to account when they could have delivered him back to Ukrainian imprisonment, what he should be in a Ukrainian prison. It was the Russians who then lied about invading Crimea and then invaded Crimea anyway after saying, oh, that's not us, I don't know what you're talking about. They then backed the Donbass rebels for 8 years, killing countless people by fueling that rebellion and being directly involved through FSB agents like Igor Girkin, who shot down civilian airliners, right? And then eventually lied about training exercises on the Ukrainian border that eventually led to the Russian invasion. So for me, every single stage of this conflict, it was the Russians pushing it forward. And you can say NATO is the cause. And I understand that for you, it's the expansion of NATO that's really scary. There was no risk of Ukraine joining NATO on February 24th when the invasion was launched, when the expanded invasion was launched. There was no risk. Nothing had changed. Whether we like it or not, and I don't like it, Russia was in Ukraine's international recognized territory in Crimea. They were also in it in Luhansk and Donetsk. There is no way for Ukraine to join NATO as long as it is engaged in a border dispute. As long as it's engaged in a border dispute and large swaths of its territory is occupied, all of the mechanisms that it would need to go through to end up joining NATO are locked down indefinitely. Russia, unironically, when it comes to its geostrategic interests, had basically preserved itself from having to deal with the idea of Ukraine joining in that current situation, which is why the invasion boggles me so much, is they gave up that good hand and escalated the conflict. And that's not to mention that Olaf Scholz offered to make a deal where Ukraine would not be able to join NATO for at least 30 years. And you want to know what? That 30-year deal wouldn't even require them giving up Crimea, giving up Luhansk, or giving up Donetsk. It was a 30-year deal flat on top of the fact that Russia is occupying Crimea, which stops Ukraine from joining NATO at any point. They were the ones who pushed this conflict forward at every point. They were the ones who invaded. They were the ones who fired the first shot. And now they want to play the victim.
No. So again, this is very great storytelling. I'll give you that. You're great at storytelling. You're great at emotional.
Do you have to virtue signal after every time I talk?
But well, that's because what you're doing. I'm just stating the facts. Is that what you're doing is you're weaving a narrative to make your side look so innocent. But if I were to do the same thing, you'd just say, well, you're just taking the Russian Kremlin propaganda. When all I have to do is look at what NATO has been doing. They've been expanding NATO for decades. They've had talks with Zelensky prior to the invasion. They had been training Ukrainian troops, despite Ukraine technically not being in the alliance. They've been training them and supplying them with weapons. And then on top of that, there have been talks about putting nuclear weapons back in Ukraine, which is a direct threat, especially when you have a hostile regime in power against Russia. That's the facts on the ground. And if you think that Russia's out of line for saying that's a red line you cannot cross, that's fine. But I can just simply say that your entire emotional pleading that you were doing back there is just that. It's just narrative building.
I didn't emotionally plead. I just said what happened.
It's narrative building. You're trying to pull at the heartstrings by saying it's the glorious revolution.
Let him respond, JY.
What I did is said the Russians invaded Crimea. They annexed Crimea after saying they weren't there. Then, they shot down a civilian airliner. Igor Girkin has admitted to many of these things on his social media platforms, on his podcast. FSB agent, former Ministry of Defense of the DNR. This isn't nothing I just said was scandalous or trying to virtue signal. But could you repeat that last point you said quickly? I forgot it.
All you're doing is appealing to a sense of nationalism for Ukraine, something that you wouldn't hold to other countries. And something
I remember. I got it. So you were talking about this idea of NATO was talking about putting nuclear weapons in Ukraine. There was no shot we were going to get nuclear weapons in Ukraine as long as they were not in NATO. You know it. I know it. Andrew can't say, but he probably knows it. It would be integral for them to join NATO before any nuclear weapon would enter the Ukrainian territory. And knowing that Ukraine can't join NATO as long as they have a territorial dispute in Russia, and Russia is occupying Crimea, which up to that war wasn't going anywhere, there was no way for Ukraine to join NATO and no way for nuclear weapons to be placed there. Whether or not Zelensky said during a conference hey, the Russians invaded us, we were told our territory to be respected, maybe we should talk about nuclear weapons again. Maybe we should have that conversation. Him saying that is not a justification. Him acknowledging that is not a justification to invade the country, because that was the start of some process of getting nuclear weapons in Ukraine. There was no shot nuclear weapons going to be placed within Ukraine anytime in the near future. There was no reason to invade this country, even for Russia's geostrategic interests, which I don't respect anyway.
Okay, so you just admitted that even if Russia had legitimate geopolitical interests, you would just dismiss them anyways. So really, there is no winning a debate with you. There is no convincing you of Russia's legitimate interests. Your interests are purely Russia big bad guy, therefore Ukraine good guy. That's really what it comes down to. And then of course, again, you're narrative building. You're weaving a narrative to make it look obviously lopsided against Russia. I mean, that's obvious.
Is anything I said wrong when it comes to NATO membership and nuclear weapons?
I think that is wrong. I think that even if you were to say that, there's no shot. Well, actually, they said there was no shot that there'd be nuclear weapons in Finland, and yet Finland conveniently left out in their proposal nuclear weapons. So again, all of these things are ignoring the idea that Russia has So again, I think I've won this debate purely because you have not argued that Russia didn't have legitimate geopolitical interests. You're simply saying they're not very good, or I don't like them, and I wouldn't agree with them even if they did have them.
Okay, so the debate wasn't, does Russia have good geostrategic interests that maybe the world should listen to, or does Russia have geostrategic interests? Every country has geostrategic interests. Israel has geostrategic interests to keep the Golan Heights occupied. They have strategic interest to keep a lot of territory occupied. Does that mean that every inch of territory that they've taken, that means they deserve to have it, and we should just say, oh, well, it's good for their country's strategic interests, so they should be allowed to have it? There's a lot of territory around the world that nations could take for their strategic interests that they shouldn't. For example, it would have been within America's strategic interest to invade Cuba, like we tried to do with the Bay of Pigs, and try to take over and install Batista again. That would have been completely within America's geostrategic interest, and try to preserve Cuba as an American stronghold. That doesn't make it right. It doesn't mean I would support it. And my point is, I got to drag it back to it, is there is no way, and Lewis, I have to think we would agree to this. There is no way for Ukraine to join NATO as long as Russia has parts of Ukraine occupied. There is specific clauses within NATO's founding documents preventing this from happening. Other countries would obviously object to it because they don't want to be dragged into a hot war over this, and other countries openly voiced their objections. Germany made this offer for 30 years behind closed doors. Why? Because they didn't want a hot war over this, and they didn't even really consider Ukraine as a nation state they would want to bring in. It's not in their strategic interest. And so for me, I'm just want you to acknowledge that there was no possible way for Ukraine to join NATO as long as Russia had Crimea occupied. I just want you to acknowledge that.
I think what the NATO would do is they would do what is necessary to finagle the system, just like they're finagling the system with all sorts of things.
So they would just change the Constitution.
Just like, hold on, documents. Just like they promised, both verbally and in treaties, that they would not move NATO one inch towards the east, and yet they did. So NATO will do whatever is necessary for NATO to expand its power and influence over these countries. Because let's be honest, adding Latvia, like I mentioned earlier, adding Latvia or Ukraine or any of these countries to NATO has no purpose other than to be able to put strategic assets next to Russia and threaten Russia's territorial integrity. Period. That's the only reason that they would add those countries, because they offer nothing of benefit. You could argue Ukraine because they have a substantial sized military, but that was only built up in recent years when they started flirting with the idea of being in NATO. So again, Finland and Sweden, all these countries, they don't offer.
We have to cut it, guys. We have to cut it there. We're going to have to move into closing statements and then get to callers. That segment's going to take a little while too as callers come through. There's never a great time to end a debate, no matter who you end it with mid-speak. When you have something as contentious as this, it never seems fair. But you both are pretty experienced debaters. I'm sure that you understand. That's just the way it's got to be. So we are going to move into closing statements. In this particular case, Dylan, JY opened first, so I'm going to let you close first and then move over to JY. You have the same amount of time on the clock, 7 minutes. Now, just so your audience knows, Dylan, the Crucible does things a little bit different. When the debate is done, the closing statements are done, we consider the debate to be over. But that doesn't mean that there won't continuously be exchanges with callers and things like this. I may interject with some questions of my own as we go. Yep. Dylan, go ahead with your closing statement. You have 7 minutes on the clock.
So the first thing I want to say is the no inch eastward agreement. It had to do with Germany. Gorbachev made an agreement behind closed doors. There's disagreements to exactly what was agreed to. Even Gorbachev himself has kind of flip-flopped on exactly what was agreed to. But from my understanding is this agreement was verbal. What other agreement on paper, I would love to see it, because I am not familiar with it. Maybe you could bring some information to me that I don't know. But as far as I know, the claim is that this claim was made verbally, and what the United States continues to say is that was a policy about East Germany. This was before the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was about the future of East Germany and whether there was going to be NATO bases in a reunified Germany. That is what I believe the negotiation was about. Obviously, between then and now, the geostrategic situation has changed greatly, and I actually don't know if we have NATO bases in East Germany now. We probably do now. I'm unfamiliar. But if that's the case, then you know what? We can withdraw our military bases from East Germany and then deploy them in Ukraine. As for the next point, I don't really think you're being 100% honest with me when you believe that NATO would have found a way to allow a state currently at war with Russia to join NATO, even if its territory is occupied by another country and they're engaged in a territorial dispute. And they're going to get all of the major NATO countries and all the subordinate ones to at least give it a check mark. They're going to be able to make them do that in order to make Ukraine join NATO. And that was a pressing concern when the invasion happened on February 24th, that this war couldn't have been avoided, this bloodshed, this death, which you said that you're principally anti-war, that all of this couldn't have been avoided or negotiated or at least kicked down the road for a better opportunity to be addressed in the future, that couldn't have happened because America and the West were planning to do that. There's no evidence to show that they were moving to change NATO's constitution or founding documents or anything to make the joining of NATO any different. There's no evidence that any country was even motivated in that direction, that they were going to do that. So I think there's a lot of assumptions about something that is almost universally agreed upon to have not been a possibility. Ukraine's NATO membership would have happened once Ukraine is no longer engaged in a territorial dispute with Russia and they have reclaimed all of their internationally recognized territory. Then it would be safe for them to join NATO, not only geostrategically, but also when it comes to like what's allowed in NATO. It's not like we haven't denied countries NATO membership for this before. We did it to Ukraine, we did it to Georgia, and we'll do it to other states probably in the future if something like this ever happens again. So I don't know why this situation is special, that they were going to give Ukraine the special NATO privileges and allow them to join. I think this invasion has been brutal. When he says that that international law has been followed, there have been multiple documented instances of war crimes being done. I have been present and filmed war crimes myself, including the shelling of civilians in Mykolaiv city center. A Russian artillery shell fell 200 feet away from me and killed somebody right there. That was a civilian. That was a war crime. 24 people were injured that day. 2 were killed. I have been to the mass graves. I have seen these myself, but you don't need to believe me. I'm a lying liberal, right? But you do need to believe your own eyes. And there's plenty of footage of Russian soldiers executing civilians in the Bucha area and around the Kiev area during the earlier offensives. And there's tons of audio of Russian soldiers calling home to their wives and describing war crimes they committed and how they feel regret, but they were given no other option and they just had to do it. This isn't even, I think, that disputed by, I mean, you could say maybe that it was deepfake voice or it's deepfake video, but I would need to see somebody decode that evidence to prove that it was deepfake, because up to now, no one has proved that any of this footage of war crimes have been deepfaked. I think Russia's brutality has been particularly recorded in this war. I think it's been particularly bad, and I think that the moral thing to do is for the West to continue to support Ukraine until it pushes Russia out. And one last thing on the nuclear threat. The one thing that I think increases the nuclear threat in this world is if we give the message to the international community that you can fail in a military invasion. You can look like it's your own Vietnam 2.0, and you can just win all of your objectives just because you threaten to blow up the world. That's a ridiculous international standard to set, and it's going to encourage other state actors in the future to engage in that behavior. And that means more problems down the road and a less safe world internationally. I'll end it there because we'll probably continue to go back and forth after.
Thank you so much for that closing statement, Dylan. JY, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think broadly speaking, my argument from the get-go was to say that Russia had geopolitical interests that it was interested in holding. It gave numerous attempts over a very long period of time saying this was a red line that they did not want crossed. I believe that Dylan has not done anything but hand wave those arguments away, saying that, well, Russia did this or did that. It's actually Russia's fault. I found those arguments to be weak. Civilian casualties that he mentioned died from shelling. Civilian casualties are inevitable in any war, any conflict. So no one was arguing that no civilian casualties should be happened. However, one should avoid as much as possible. If Russia wanted to, Russia has the munitions and the capability of leveling every major city in Ukraine down to the last freaking pillar. If they really wanted to, but they haven't. Something that the United States basically did in Iraq, which is the point I was trying to make when I brought up Iraq. Iraq is a prime example of the United States talking out of one side, saying human rights abuses in Ukraine, but then saying, well, we did basically way worse, but we're just going to ignore that. I find it very hypocritical. I find NATO very hypocritical. I find NATO is nothing but a net detriment to U.S. interests abroad and to NATO and broadly to the EU abroad. It brings no advantageous solutions to those peoples, and all it does is stoke tensions with other countries that are nuclear powers. And from my perspective, if you believe that a country has enough weaponry to essentially wipe off the face of the earth, you take them a little bit more seriously when they say this is a red line. And I think that continually throughout the Russian Federation's short history so far, the United States and NATO has continually dismissed their concerns on the international stage. This is very, very demonstrable. All you have to do is look up Russians' UN speeches throughout the last 20 years. You just look up Vladimir Putin's speeches from the last 20 years. In fact, you can even look at his last 3 to 4 speeches that he's done. And every single one of them, he's very clear about the reasons he's doing this. Now, you could disagree, and you could say that those are false, or you could say that they're wrong. But to say that from a Russian perspective, not a U.S. perspective, not a Ukrainian perspective, but a Russian perspective, that they did not have legitimate interests in the war in Ukraine, I think is false, which then implies what standard are we going to apply here? I asked early on in the debate for Dylan to give me a standard in which he can apply at least relatively consistently across the board to all these different conflicts, which he has no problem with. Or will maybe even say, well, I'm not really interested in that one, or maybe it's not that big of a deal to me, or maybe they're justified. But he can't give me a standard in which this specific conflict, the Ukrainian conflict, breaks it.
Is that your closing, JY?
That would be my closing.
Okay, thank you guys so much. Thank you for the spirited debate, and it was a spirited debate. Before we move into callers, just let me remind everybody that whole call to action thing. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, all that bullshit that you know you're supposed to do. We need it. Also, Dylan's smoking, so that's at least something in his direction that I can give him, right? That's like, at least there's that, Dylan. You know, at least you started smoking. It was time. We knew it was time, so good on you for that. Make sure that you send in your super chats. Now, we are taking call-ins. If anybody from Dylan Burns chat wants to call in, has questions for JY Lewis, that's fine as well. You can hop in our Discord. Mods will vet you, and we will get you in to take that call. And then after that, we'll be moving into super chats. First caller tonight is Synth. Synth, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can. How's my audio coming through?
It's coming through well. Go ahead.
Sure. So I've got a question for JY. At least JY first. JY, in the past, you've told me only idiots believe in nukes. You've told me nuclear weapons couldn't possibly work, and you've told me that nukes aren't real. Andrew can confirm I'm being honest here because he was there for it, and I believe we even wanted to set up a debate on that topic. So my question for you, yay or nay, have you changed your position? Do you currently believe nuclear weapons are not real?
As they are stated in the media, I don't believe that they're real. However, I do believe that there are weapons that are capable of significant destructive capacity, and I admitted that even in the discussion we had. I just don't believe the media narrative behind it. No, I don't think the narrative behind nuclear, like Armageddon, is as real as people make it out.
No, I'm not talking about nuclear Armageddon. To clarify my question, I'm talking about nuclear weapons being real.
As they're defined, I already answered that question.
You don't think that there are any weapons that use any kind of nuclear physics? Is that correct? No nuclear weapons exist.
I'm saying as they're defined and the results that they have.
Sorry, what I was asking you is not as they're defined. I'm just asking you, right, with the definition of a nuclear weapon being a weapon that uses nuclear power, right, to cause some kind of explosion, some kind of nuclear fusion bomb. Do you think these are not real? Is that correct?
You can ask it 4 different ways to Sunday.
I just want to make it clear for the audience.
Okay, but I answered it, and I think that that's 3 times now.
I don't know. Felt relatively dodgy, but I'll go ahead and ask my question for Dylan. Dylan, my question for you is, do you agree that NATO is not democratic, i.e. it doesn't represent people's preferences impartially, the preferences of the member nations impartially?
I don't think it's necessarily democratic, and I don't know if military alliances need to necessarily be democratic. I think they should be based on the idea of democracy in the states within it. I don't think the structure of a military alliance needs to necessarily be democratic. I think that can be different because different states have different levels of influence and different capacity. The idea for me, personally, I think the EU has one big flaw, and I think the big flaw is the idea that one EU member state can cause as much ruckus as they can, especially, but NATO's big ruckus is, I think, somewhat similar to that. My belief about NATO is that it does not necessarily have to be a democratic organization. I do believe it should represent democratic values, as in the alliance is made up of democratic states. That's why I am so skeptical of Turkey's membership, because I'm skeptical of their commitment to democracy.
Take notes, JY. That was a great answer to a question. That's how you answer questions properly. I don't have any more questions unless JY has an answer for me about whether or not nuclear weapons
interested
exist.
in the meta stuff that you always do. So you can move on. I answered the question clearly, and I don't think that I need to answer it again.
Okay. Can I ask one clarifying question? Oh, yeah, go ahead, Dylan. I think you could ask the same question.
No, I just wanted to ask, when you say like nukes, like when you say some concept of they're talking about media are not real, what do you mean by that? Because like I think of like, Fallout 4 and like, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, radiation sucks and it'll kill you type stuff,
Well, I think that as one of the people that helped design nuclear weapons, even admitted that radiation is a vastly fear-mongered thing. I think the idea that we have these weapons that are going to cause nuclear radiation that is going to cause places to be uninhabitable for years and years, and everyone's going to turn in. The Hollywood media and the government has a vested interest in making people as scared as possible of these things, and that's my position.
Tell them what you told me about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, about the radiation.
Oh yeah, those were mostly fire bombings. They were largely not.
Wow.
They were largely not a single bomb. Tokyo was much more devastated than Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
You also don't believe there was radiation from those bombs, correct? That's what you told me.
There was no measurable effect of radiation that you wouldn't have in a firebombing. Firebombings cause irradiated material as well.
I do think there's a difference
like
in effect, though, right? Because
the entire city of Nagasaki and Hiroshima were rebuilt within 20 to 30 years of the bombings happening, and by all objective measurements, that should not have been possible. Completely rebuilt. I'm not saying that they weren't completely leveled.
I wasn't gonna ask about that. I was gonna ask that, like, if you look at the injuries that a lot of people faced, like, it was very obvious that that wasn't like burns, like a regular burn from firebombing.
Yeah,
it was
firebombings are not.
So like the radiation caused injuries are unique, though. That is radiation based injuries.
No, I think there's enough reasons.
How do you?
I think there's
radiation based injuries.
I think there's enough reasons to be skeptical of the Japanese narrative. First off, there was only one reporter ever allowed on the ground to report on the actual effects.
You think the Japanese are lying about this?
Well, the Japanese, if you read the post-war reports that they initially got from Nagasaki and Hiroshima, they didn't even admit that. So.
Is this like a different version of, like, okay, I don't mean to make this comparison, but when I talk to certain people, it's like, well, certain Jewish people lie about the Holocaust in a certain way to, like, elicit sympathy. Is this like the same, like, theme of, like the Japs lie about I'm saying this is an aggressive, like, oh, they're lying about
the Japs.
The Japanese.
How racist are you?
Very sorry.
How racist are you?
The Japanese are lying about Nagasaki and Hiroshima to elicit sympathy from the West.
They're not. They're not. Like I said, the post-war reports from Japan, the initial reports from the military, all said that it was fire bombings. There was no unusual report from the military standpoint. They didn't say there was these weird burns and people have never seen this before. They melted their skin off and stuff like that. They didn't have these weird reports. Just read the initial reports that came out in Japanese. Of course, it's in Japanese, so it'd be required to read that. But I would highly recommend saying that the United States had a vested interest in over-exaggerating the effects of the bombs. I'm not saying the bombs weren't dropped. I'm saying that the effects of the bombs are not as people claim they are. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that those bombs that they didn't drop very large bombs that.
But it's not radiation. Is what you're saying. It's not radiation.
It didn't irradiate the place to where it was unlivable because the cities were rebuilt within 20 years.
Well,
of irradiated damage.
I mean,
rebuilt means entirely rebuilt.
You know what?
By the way,
I am not an expert in this whatsoever, so I'm just gonna. I'm gonna leave it at that. But
so my position remains my position remains the same as it always has been.
Well, I'm not trying to debate you off of it. I'm just more confused.
No, it's fine. I'm just saying that Synth is just trying to do this because what he's trying to do is say, it's an argument from incredulity. He's saying, oh, can you believe he actually believes that this is possibly not something as the narrative suggests?
Actually,
therefore you can dismiss. Hold on. Therefore, you can dismiss all of his other arguments because he's silly on this one. That's all he's trying to do. He's trying to use one to try and he believes unicorns exist, therefore he can be wrong on all these other things. It's a silly argument, and Synth is just silly, which is why I tend not to engage with him.
Can I say one thing, JY? And then I'll let Andrew kick me off and I can be the next person. You can count these as like the words of wisdom before I leave out, right? Just JY, the whole reason I'm bringing that up is because the entire conversation has been around if Russia's perceived nuclear threat is legitimate. That's why I brought that up.
No, I remember. The thing is, I was going to debate somebody else. It wasn't going to be him. Who is it going to be, Andrew? I forget his name. The guy who believes Atlantis is real.
This was Witsit Gets It.
Witsit Gets It. Apparently, he doesn't believe in it at all either, I think. He doesn't believe in it either. So is this becoming like a trend? Like, is this becoming like a trend where people just, nukes aren't real? Dude, I should agree to that because then my position gets like 10 times easier. Oh my God. Yeah, you know what? Nukes aren't real. Fuck you, Russia. Prove it.
JY, when it comes to the science of nuclear fission, do you disagree with it on like a fundamental
I'm
level?
not debating a non-nuclear physicist
I'm not-
on
I'm
the science
just
of nuclear
asking you.
physicists, so you can go
I'm just
now.
asking.
I'm not
you. Neither
answering.
of us are nuclear physicists, right? You
Yeah,
are
got
neither,
it.
right?
I'm not answering.
Okay, I'm just trying to ask. Like, I feel like it's a genuine question.
Don't care.
I'm not even.
Not
It's
answering.
open-ended, right? I don't care what answer you give me as long
Yeah,
as you give
got
me
it.
something.
Go. I'm done.
Nothing.
This isn't on the Ukraine debate
have to
anymore.
wonder.
Go away.
Do you have anything pertinent towards Russia, Ukraine itself?
Yeah. So Casimir earlier, if I can grab his question, asked a question in chat towards that I thought was pretty pertinent. Towards JY. I guess it's gone now, so I don't think I'm gonna be able to grab it. But I was kind of just wondering, JY, if you think that it's just the case that the propaganda surrounding the damage of radioactive weapons is true here in the West, or also in like in Eastern European countries. Do you think it's also true there as well?
Like, what about Chernobyl? Like, do you think Chernobyl was like a?
I think it's broadly true across the board. I think that they over dramatize the effects of these things for propaganda purposes. And I think all countries do this, by the way, not just the United States. I think Russia does it too. So, and I think they have a vested interest in doing that because it keeps people in line.
Well, I will say the Russians did lie about Chernobyl, but they lied about it the other way, that it was a lot less bad than it was. It gave a lot of people cancer, killed a ton of animals. They had to execute so many animals, removed tons of people from their homes. They lost their homes. My God, Chernobyl was such a disaster. And and the legacy is really still there. I actually met a Chernobyl liquidator. Actually, no, I met the wife of a Chernobyl liquidator whose apartment burned down because of Russian bombing. I met her, but she told me a lot of amazing stories about the man.
We appreciate your call very much, Synth. Thank you so much for calling in. You know, I'm surprised. I thought we would be flooded with callers like we usually are, but we don't actually have a lot of callers tonight. So if somebody else, I'm going to give
Anybody
it 5.
from my chat?
Oh, sorry. There we go. I kind of knew that there would be more callers.
Aircraft.
Aircraft
Hey.
Sparky, you're on the Crucible. Thank you so much for your call in. Go ahead with your question.
Oh no! Look, this was an interesting debate. Look, so I've got 2 questions. First of all, JY, what is Russian military doctrine? What is it based on? Because you talked about air superiority. By a Western standard, Russia doesn't even do rudimentary training in that, as far as coordination. So I'm really questioning.
My initial understanding of Russian military doctrine is as good as pretty much any Western person's understanding of it, because the Russians are always very pointed about what they believe. Their doctrine is less about air superiority and more about artillery superiority, which is proven based on how they're fighting this war, which is very defensive and allowing the enemy to come into open spaces and then use the open spaces to engage them.
Okay.
That's based on how I've seen the war play out. That's how I've seen it. I don't think air superiority was something that they were seeking to have. And I don't think they ever actually said that publicly either.
Actually, they said they had air superiority multiple times. They said they actually disabled basically the entirety of the Ukrainian Air Force in the first 48 hours. As we know, it's day 257. Ukrainian Air Force is still high flying, still shooting down, well, mostly missiles, but they're still working. They're still functioning. They intended to disable the Ukrainian Air Force. Yeah. They said they did it, which they didn't.
Well, and so that brings me to you, Dylan. You claim that they didn't, but however, if it wasn't for Western powers actually feeding Ukraine, this war would already be over. Would you agree with that?
Would this war be over?
I think there would still be like some
I think
some disorganized fighting, but
it would really,
nothing.
honestly, it's hard to think. I don't think Russia would have ever under any circumstances taken over all of Ukraine. I think they were too corrupt. I think there is a possibility that they could have gotten to the river that flows through Kiev, and maybe they could have gotten to that line. Maybe it would have been easier for them. But the issues they had wasn't from, hey, we had it properly planned to fight out Ukraine in a sludge fest. Their plan was the government was just supposed to collapse, kinda. And you could tell that from these long corridors they used to try to get into Kiev, the same way they approached Kharkiv. I mean, they underestimated how much resistance they were going to get. And I think that led to them making a lot of decisions that would have been the same in a scenario where we didn't provide as much support, and it would have still led to a lot of problems. So I don't think there's any circumstance where they take over all of Ukraine. I do think there's a circumstance where they could have taken enough from Ukraine to force them to the negotiating table to either give up more territory or give up being militarized, like having weapons, having a standing army, which they need, obviously. So I do think it might be different. I don't think like Ukraine as it exists today would cease to exist. I don't think Zelensky's government would have ever collapsed.
If I may engage real quick with that too. I think that Russia is very just kind of pragmatic and forthright with their goals and things. Initially, the early days of the conflict in the portion that is considered the special military operation, their goal was to shock and awe and get the Kiev regime to come to the negotiating table in Turkey, that was planned and that is reported on both sides. And then through some people say Biden, but broadly NATO pressure, Ukraine believed that they would be able to put up enough resistance to where Russia would back off. But instead, Russia saw a point of no return. And I think that's the reason why they've escalated the conflict to mobilization. And I believe that NATO's false promises of support is what is causing this war to tragically go on and cause a lot more lives to be lost, which is why while I'm not like a Russian sycophant, I think the reason I broadly support Russia in this conflict is because I want as swift of end to conflict as possible. And I think Russia has much more reasonable terms than NATO does. Zelensky recently said, one more sentence.
Okay.
Zelensky recently said he is not going to give up until Russia's driven out of even Crimea. That's never
true. Based, amazing opinion. Finally, a good take from you.
I actually, so I need to ask, and this is for both of you. If you were to try to objectively determine what the goals for the Russian special military operation to be, what their actual goals were, not their stated goals, but their planned goals, what would you consider it to be?
I think at first it was to overthrow the government and replace it with a separate government. I think that's why they aimed for Kiev early on. That's why we had all the fighting around Kiev early on. They tried to go basically into every major city. They made a beeline for every major city. I think they wanted to take over all the government hubs. And I think they kind of looked at Ukraine kind of like a rotten edifice that you just kick in the door and it goes and it just collapses. I think they kind of viewed it that way, and that wasn't true. Now, I think their goal is basically to salvage whatever they can. They can't really demilitarize Ukraine anymore. They can't really take over all of Ukraine anymore and like replace it with a new government. They're not going to get rid of Zelensky's government. He's here to stay. And so now they're trying to see how much territory they can scrape away. And that's why they annexed Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk before now losing very shortly the city of Kherson, losing a bunch of territory around Kharkiv, losing Lyman. And they seem to be basically retreating around the river, over the river right now. They're getting slaughtered, and so I think now it's just how much territory can they grab out of this? They're trying to salvage it so they can go home and say, "Hey, this is what we fought for." Because if they leave, then Putin has to turn to his government and say, "Nothing. Sorry. Can I stay in government anymore?" And I don't think the Russian people would like that idea.
JY, go ahead.
Yeah, I think what I said earlier, which is that the early days of the war was Russia trying to pressure them into basically agreeing to the Minsk agreements, which is what Putin has said in multiple speeches, is that the initial stages of the conflict were meant to pressure Ukraine into signing the agreements that they found reasonable. And I think that was the initial reasons for the conflict. Afterwards, I think that Russia realized that NATO was never going to allow that to happen, that they wanted to cause as much damage to Russia as possible on an international stage. And so Russia, I believe, and Putin to a large degree, saw no other recourse other than to engage in what I would call demilitarization. So the war transitioned from a pressure campaign, which is why they surrounded Kiev, Kharkov, and all these cities, was more of a pressure tactic to kind of confuse the enemy. But once they realized that this was going to be a knockdown, great dragout, they retreated from areas they found unnecessary and solidified their positions in other areas with the limited troops they had. Once they realized that there was still no negotiations going to happen, they did partial mobilization, which is what we see now. I think estimates are that they have about 30% mobilized, or 30 to 40% mobilized. So they still have about 60% more people that they're going to throw into that region. Kherson's an empty city. It's a no, even if they take it, they've already they've already evacuated all the civilians
and looted it. Yeah.
And
not all the civilians. No, that's not true.
And they have also left a residual force of Russians behind to hold back the Ukrainians. Once the Ukrainians take the city, they could just bomb it to oblivion.
Why are they leaving?
Because they're, as I said multiple times throughout the debate, the Russians are casualty adverse to their own people. They want to cause as much damage to Ukrainian forces and cause as little damage to their forces. And so what they're trying to do is, by retreating, they can draw the forces out into the open and obliterate them.
They're
which is
casualty
a meat grinder.
Adverse.
Yes.
What happened at Lyman? Why did they wait until they were encircled to order a retreat?
Well, I think it's early to make any sort of objective claims of what happened on the ground there. I think it's too early in a conflict.
I think they disregarded the lives of their soldiers. I think that's what they did.
Sure. Okay, if that's the narrative you want to paint, sure.
I mean, you can call it a narrative, but I mean, they were just mowing down buses of men, just trying to burst through the line after they waited too long to
Dylan, you would have to agree, though, to move over to JY's point, that the fog of war is still very much steep at the moment. And don't you think it is going to be difficult until probably several years after the conflict to actually tell what did or did not happen in certain battlefields?
I think to get the specifics down to a T, that's going to take time, but I think there's still general things we can look at to have an idea of how something went. For example, after D-Day, I think it was pretty easy for a lot of generals to get an after-action report to be like, okay, this is what we're going to tell the press, and the press had a general idea that there was a landing, maybe around 1,000 soldiers died, and now we have established a foothold in Germany, and you have a general idea of what happened. The very nitty-gritty specifics, I do think takes time and probably historical review, but I think Russia's just lack of planning when it came to logistics earlier in this war kind of showed a disregard when they were sending their men in. I don't know if it's because they don't care about their soldiers. I don't think that's true. I just think they're perfectly willing to absorb casualties, or at least treat their soldiers with not enough care, like not enough actual care. Like they can care mentally, but not care when it comes to actual maintenance of them.
Gotcha. Okay, Aircraft Sparky, thank you so much for your call in. Appreciate it very much.
Yes. One last thing, Andrew, and just a critique on both of y'all's point of view on this. From an objective military standard, it would appear that Russia started out with the idea of trying to create a land bridge from Russia to Crimea, because the bridge, the logistics involved with that original connection just is a little overburdening. I believe that the assault, Dylan, on Kiev was more of a distraction in order to draw people away from the wanted territorial lands that they wanted to get.
Man,
and they thought maybe there was an opportunity that there would be enough chaos to where maybe the current government would collapse, but that didn't happen. They didn't send enough people in towards the Kiev era for it to be a proper invasion. Estimates by a slim margin, if you wanted to just barely scrape by, would have been around 300,000 soldiers if you were going to do strictly a land campaign without enough air support. Russia does not have the proper tactics to do air superiority.
Can I ask you a question quick?
Yes, sir.
So for me, I heavily disagree with the idea that it was a distraction, because why would they, because Lewis told us they're risk averse, so they want to protect them. They're
not risk averse.
Why did they do those VDV landings of these very important, high maintenance, very high quality soldiers? Why did they drop them near the capital when they all got?
Well, they dropped them out at around 5,000 feet, Dylan. So not really all that elite. In fact, it was a dumb move.
It was. You can say
it was
dumb, but why would they attempt to do this? Right? Why would they attempt to do this if they didn't think the government was just going to collapse?
So I looked at it as more of a deal to try to shock and awe, to scare them. Oh no, the VDV are coming, and it turns out it was an incompetent airborne operation. I think I even made that critique on one of your streams in your chat.
Unfortunately, Aircraft,
yeah.
I'm sorry, we do have to move on to other callers. I really appreciate you coming on. Appreciate it very much. Will, you've been waiting patiently. Can you hear us okay? Will, are you there?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so I have a question for JY. I think JY has mentioned a lot about like how NATO should be considerate of Russian geostrategic like goals and ideals, right? But I'm also wondering the flip side. do you consider NATO's geostrategic ideals and like objectives to be valid or worthy of debate?
Well, I think that
For
the
example, so
Yeah, yeah.
can I just like give an example? Like, so you asked about like the Baltics, right? Why would NATO want the Baltics to be in their vicinity? Well, I mean, one reason is just peace and stability in Europe, right? Like, usually when countries join NATO, their defense budgets collapse because they're just under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, right? There's no need for like massive amounts of tanks or like all these sorts of things. So I guess that's sort of like the thing I was thinking about. What's your response to that?
No, I think that's a good point, but I would push back on this, that I think that it's that international organizations of multiple countries don't have geopolitical interests. Otherwise, what you're saying is that there is one country with geopolitical interests and then vassal states of that. So what I would say is that if anything, NATO is just a representation of the American empire exerting its own influence over more and more vassal states. And so that's why their defense budgets collapse, because the empire, just like in Rome, would take the cost of defending their vassals. And so what I would say is that NATO doesn't actually have geopolitical interests other than, in theory, the defense of its members. Expanding the amount of members actually doesn't benefit the members already in it, because it creates more liabilities, potentially, more sparks that can light a flame. And particularly with Ukraine being as corrupt as it was when the initial talks started, I think that it's something that doesn't comport, because I think that ultimately the only geopolitical interests that really actually truly exist are those of nation states. I don't think NATO counts as a nation state unless you want to then relabel it as
Okay, how about
just an extension of the American empire.
Just relabel it as America, right? Like Amerito or something, right? Like,
well, I think it harms America's interests,
also
if anything.
just like a nation like exerting its geopolitical influence for like the betterment of itself. Isn't that also just valid?
Sure, yeah, but I don't think it actually does benefit America. Now, that's a whole nother debate topic, and that's very lengthy, but I don't actually think that NATO expansion benefits America. I think it harms it, especially the people in it. It may benefit the warmongers and the mega companies and the contracting companies for defense contractors, but it certainly doesn't benefit the American citizen. Anyone who's living in America knows how bad inflation has been, knows how bad cost of living has gone up.
So caller with your hang on a second, Dylan. We want to try to get you guys out of here at the 3-hour mark if we can, right? So caller, if you have one more question, go ahead with it, and then we got to move on to our other callers. Go ahead.
All right, it's a relatively quick one to Dylan. I was just wondering, like, what exactly should be like Ukraine's plan to conquer Crimea? Because obviously it's been with Russia for like 8 years, right? Russia's like dug in pretty damn heavily. Russia also considers it like more important than pretty much anything else, right? They've occupied in Ukraine, even like the Donbass nations. Like every time Russia's thrown a tantrum, it's because of Crimea, right? And so I'm just saying, like, how can Ukraine like conquer Crimea, but still like attain like the support of the entire world, who at that point might be tired of this thing?
I do want to quickly just say, because he got to make his case, I just want to make a very quick case before answering. I do think that NATO does benefit the American people. I think the transatlantic alliance has allowed America to be very economically powerful, has allowed us through the Marshall Plan to develop deep economic ties that allowed us to come out of the Second World War as one of the most powerful economic powers in the world. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate the power of our economic and military relationship with Europe generally. Past that point, what was the question you asked again?
Basically, how would you
take it back from me? I'm not a strategist, and I can't tell you the specifics. That's my first answer, but then I'll have a follow-up answer. My position is that right now, Russia is in a very, very weak military position from what we originally thought they were going to be in. We thought, the whole world thought, that Ukraine would basically collapse in a week. Everybody thought it, and people can like say like after the fact that isn't the case. But if you look at U.S. policy and how it was acting, if you look at how the Russians behaved early in the war, if you look at how media was talking about it, if you look about how most military analysts even were talking about it, they thought that the Ukrainian government was going to collapse very quickly. That ended up not being the case. I think it had to do with a lot of intelligence failures. I think the West, we don't have enough human intelligence in the Russian military and in Russia and in Ukraine. I think we have a lot of technological intelligence, which allowed us to predict when this war was going to happen very quickly due to our satellites and our ability to hack Russian communications. And so I guess for me, we didn't think this was even going to last this long. And so when people talk about, oh, it's so impossible, this idea that Ukraine to take back Crimea, it's impossible what Ukraine has already achieved. And every week we hear about new Ukrainian victories. Right now, the Russians are engaged in a massive retreat across the river, across the Dnieper River. They're pulling out as they're getting fired upon. It looks like a bloodbath right now.
Dylan, I just wanted to clarify my question. I meant more diplomatically instead of militarily.
Okay.
Obviously Ukraine can just send waves upon waves of soldiers and conquer Crimea like that, but would they get any support?
Well, I don't think it would be that easy for Ukraine to conquer Crimea. I think it would be very difficult. But what I'm trying to get at this point is that Ukraine has already achieved the impossible in many ways, what people underestimated their ability to do and their ability to fight. And the Russian will to fight, I would generally say, is much weaker than the Ukrainian will to fight. You can even see that from most Russian independent polling, that support for the war seems to be starting to kind of tilt off, and most people don't really want to go there to fight. And so I think that if Russia's in a weak enough position, its military been grounded down enough that Ukraine gets a few more military victories under their belt, like if they got a breakthrough in Zaporozhye and they were able to head in the direction of Mariupol, that is a situation that is almost irrecoverable. Almost irreconcilable. What's the word? It's not recoverable. If that happens,
it's inconceivable.
Inconceivable. Sure.
It's inconceivable. Will, thank you so much for the call in.
All right,
we appreciate
thank you very much.
You can wrap up very quickly,
okay.
Dylan, before we get to
Lastly,
the next caller.
diplomatically, I think it would you would basically offer sanctions relief and a lot of other benefits, particularly maybe promises for no military bases within Ukraine. That could be monitored by UN inspectors, something like that, if you wanted to go through a diplomatic solution. But I don't think there's necessarily a diplomatic solution on the table right now.
All right. Appreciate that call in. Thank you so much, Will. OG Snoop, can you hear us okay? Thank you for waiting patiently.
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me fine?
We can. Go ahead with your questions, man.
Sweet. Put simply here, JY. There's a lot of implications expected from Dylan on why we should care about Ukrainians. But why should we care about the Russian objectives? Why is Russia important? And why is the persecution of the Russian people important for us as Americans, however you aspire to be?
From American perspective, well, I think that any person that wants to be consistent should take into consideration the interests of all people involved in any conflict. So that's the first answer to your question. The second answer to your question would be that Russia is a extremely powerful nation. Regardless of how you want to frame this war, that it's really going badly, I would argue it's not. But I didn't want to get bogged down into the details of a war debate and about a headline argument, because that's ultimately what it'd be, right? And so what I'd say is that major powers around the world, when they are affect the world. And so the reason you want to care about Russia's geopolitical interests is because they are a major power. And now we see that a multipolar world away from the United States is starting to happen. The United States is going to be badly affected by this. The BRICS is a prime example in the fact that they've already included 12 more member states, some of them major economies, and 50% of the world population. That's concerning from an American perspective. That's why they should care.
So I just want to quickly say, BRICS is for me, BRICS is cool, but it's really not that significant. I think a lot of people try to sell BRICS as if it's going to become like a new NATO or a new military alliance.
Like Ukraine, insignificant.
But the thing is, when it comes to BRICS, is China and India have a border dispute where they've killed each other over. Russia and China also have many, many differences, strategic and economic. Same thing with India and China. Same thing with many of the member states in BRICS. So BRICS is fun, it's cool, but BRICS will not be powerful enough to challenge NATO, and BRICS does not unite the foreign policies of India, China, and Russia, because many of them have contradictions. Many of them have contradictions that are irreconcilable to the level that having alliance and agreement to the level that NATO has and transatlantism has.
China and India are incredibly irrelevant. What kind of statement are you trying to make here? Irrelevant third world shithole nations, bitch.
What?
Huh?
China and India are irrelevant to what we're talking about, which is a conflict within Europe. There are foreign nations and foreign continents that are utterly irrelevant. Why are you bringing up China and India? Utterly irrelevant to the topic at hand.
Well, no.
Yes, they are.
Well, no.
Come on. Where's the relevance of India? India, superpower 2020, we're at fucking 2022, and India still has more people than they have fucking toilets? Pathetic.
So hang on, OG. Some in the chat were wondering, are you drunk right now?
No.
Oh, okay. So
I'm just an idiot.
This is your normal mode.
Andrew, is this guy one of your guys? Or
Exactly.
whose guy is this?
This is one of yours, Dylan.
This
I'm
is
telling
not.
you.
This cannot be one of mine.
This is one of yours.
Are you one of
Dylan.
mine, OG? Are you one of mine?
Dylan, I'm one of you, bro.
Oh
Filthy fucking commie.
no! Oh, a commie. Ah, yes.
All right.
So-
Let him answer real quick, OG. Go
So,
ahead, guys.
well, China and India are not that, but okay. I'll take what you say for granted and just say, okay, China's irrelevant on the world stage. Got it. I think that's just laughable, but okay.
Who has the highest? Who has the largest GDP?
Irrelevant. GDP isn't a measure of actual
You can't.
significance. Wait,
Okay.
hold on.
How are
I
you
can
gonna-
explain.
Don't say something
me
more
explain.
ridiculous than what he just said.
No, so GDP, all GDP measures is your trade, your trade, and how much capital that you move around. It doesn't actually measure.
GDP.
I'm almost done.
GDP measures the equilibrium between supply and demand of a country.
It doesn't actually measure the economic
Yes, it does.
output of the average civilian and the prosperity of the average civilian. Because if that was the case, again, then you wouldn't have people in America be in a service-based economy and not produce anything anymore. Meanwhile, China produces a lot of things, so they're not as heavily reliant on America.
Yet the average American. Wait.
Hold, Dylan, please. Hey, you got this. Right after me. GDP is the measurement of the equilibrium of supply and demand of a country. Go ahead, Dylan.
Okay. Okay. First off, I would like to say I disassociate with Mr. Snoop Dogg over here. Okay. But and also
He's your boy, Dylan.
Yeah, he's my boy. He's my boy, apparently. But the thing is, I think GDP is an important. I don't think it's the end-all factor, but I do believe it's an important economic indicator.
I didn't say it wasn't unimportant. I'm simply saying that people that say it's the end-all, be-all are
I don't think it's
idiots.
the end-all, be-all, but I do think that America is the most powerful economy on the planet. I think when it just looks at purchasing power, it's the Federal Reserve and the U.S. greenback dollar, and so I do want to make sure that we do acknowledge that, and I do want to also say to Snoop that doesn't mean India and China are irrelevant in affairs in the world. I do think China and India don't have a large to play with the invasion of Ukraine, though. I think the biggest role they have to play is that they'll do trade with Russia. As it's trying to seek other trade partners, as European energy consumers has basically gone away due to sanctions, and they've largely have not been able to make up the consumption. They've been able to make some of it, but the infrastructure just isn't existing. So they play an even smaller factor than Russia would want you to believe.
China and India are
OG.
suppliers that provide zero demand.
All right.
Provide all the
These
supply
gotta be
with
your
zero
last-
demand.
These got to be your last words. This is the caller's time. That's true. So just give us your last words, and then I got to move on to the next caller. Go ahead, man.
Hey, man, we can end it there. I think it was a really chaotic, weird discussion. I had more to ask JY about. Hey, can I end on this one thing here? JY, what's the greatest, most perfect, and best state within the United States?
Oh, I depending on what factors you look at, I would say
Texas.
I'm a fan of Alaska.
No, it's Texas.
The answer is Maryland, by the way. We're better than everyone.
No, it's not fucking Maryland. It's
Maryland.
Texas.
It's Maryland.
Texas.
It's Maryland.
Oh yeah, who do you think would win a war between Maryland and Texas, Burns?
Probably Maryland because we're small.
Nobody would ever say Maryland.
You said Alaska. Let's be honest here. It's not Alaska.
The old line state. We want
With an M, not an A.
All right. Thank you so much, OG. Take care of yourself, man. Casimir, you've been waiting so patiently. Always
Thank
save
you.
the best for last. Go ahead, Kaz.
You can hear me fine, right?
Yep.
First of all, I have to condemn Vladimir Putin. I think that he's an election fortifying and church destroying usurper. I don't support any aggression that harms civilians and destroys so much property and just uproots so many people. I don't think it was ever a good solution. And I have two questions. One of them is relates to the beginning of the conflict, but also how it likely will have to be resolved. I'm not sure if it was mentioned, but there was a blocking of the water canal that brings water to Crimea from the Dnieper River. And with the result of civilians, basically innocents, farmers, losing their fields, losing their livestock, including Crimean Tatars who are heavily reliant on that industry. So I wonder whether both sides consider that justified and whether that should be restored and remain restored and never severed again.
If you want my answer, I understand why they did it. Crimea was annexed illegally. I don't think they should have done it, though. I think that at the end of the day, the thing that Ukraine should have as an advantage is the way it treats its people in comparison to how the Russians have treated people under the occupation, and that should mean a consistent basis of treating people, even in occupied territory, as Ukrainian civilians deserve respect. That's also why they continued to pay people's pensions in occupied territory during the last 8 years. And I think they should have that type of consistent respect for civilians. And I do think at the end of this war, no matter what the outcome is, that issue must be resolved at the negotiating table permanently.
Well, I think broadly speaking, there was really Ukraine knew that cutting off the water supply was going to be a massive provocation against Russia. Regardless of whether you believe Russia was justified in causing this conflict or going in originally, one cannot say that it's unreasonable for Russia to be upset by this. You may disagree with their actions, but I believe that it is a strong case into why it was one of the first things Russia did when they took that territory, is to undo the canal damage. So I think that what should they do? They shouldn't block it ever again. I think it's ridiculous. I think that's just another little minor thing that built up over time that caused this conflict to be so horrifically done.
I do have to say that we can call it a provocation, but Ukraine was in a position where they were facing what was supposedly the second most powerful military in the world. And they had not a lot to fight back with. What were they supposed to do? They're a newly formed nation with a wildly corrupt and somewhat inept military made up of, at the top, by old Soviet soldiers who haven't seen combat in the last, since Afghanistan, if they were there? And so they didn't have a lot of means to respond, and this is their one way. They thought, we gotta do something to fight back against the Russians. It was one of the only options they thought they had on the table. I disagree with the fact that they did it, but we should also understand the picture that when this was painted in. For example, when we talk about for example, Polish crimes against Ukrainians, which Ukrainians talk about a lot, you have to understand that there were also Ukrainian war crimes against the Poles during that fighting period. And you have to paint the full picture to understand what happened with the water getting cut off, is my opinion.
I'm glad that you both consider that unjustified, just to be sure. That was the core of my answer. I understand the reasons. I just think that this issue should be brought up because I wouldn't classify it as minor, actually. A lot of other things are sort of minor, but withdrawing a key life resource from a large population is basically like it's a crime against humanity. That's what we call it, and that's the standard we apply to everybody. Because there are other conflicts where conflicts over water supplies occur all the time. We just don't accept them being cut off. But I'm glad that both sides sort of agree on this, and that's not anywhere in the foreseeable future because that had to stop. My question is about how we should stop this. From my perspective, I believe that local people, local autonomies have like the highest regard in terms of sovereignty. If anything should be given sovereignty is people and their locales. And I wonder, I'm led to believe, I don't know whether either side will agree with me, that the area currently controlled by Russia, including Mariupol, for example, is an area where, at least in the cities, the majority of residents are Russian-speaking, Russian culture. The answers on which side they align with are not clear from that, right? There could be Russian culture, Russian-speaking individual that says that he wants to remain in Ukraine. But my question is, are both sides willing to compromise where all of the contested areas become autonomous and basically demilitarized and unaligned?
You want to take this first? I can do it if you want.
Yeah, I can. I think that I think that ship has sailed. I think Russia was willing to negotiate that position earlier on, but I think that now that they have officially, at least legally on their system, annexed those regions, they're not going to give them up. They're going to retake whatever territories they believe are part of those regions, and that's when the conflict will end if Ukraine is willing to end it. The only other way this conflict ends realistically, in my opinion, is unfortunately and tragically with the complete destruction of the younger generation of Ukrainian men. You're essentially going to have an entire generation of Ukrainian men wiped off the face of the planet, and that's tragic. That's tragic, but entirely avoidable in my opinion. And again, I believe that most of this was provocations that were avoidable. Even if you think Russia overdid its hand and maybe overreacted, I think that this is 10, 15 years of buildup.
Correction. I understand your position, your analysis, but I'm asking for your personal opinion if you're the negotiator from that side.
Oh, if I'm the negotiator. Okay. Well, if I'm the negotiator, I would say all territories annexed by Russia, and then Ukraine acts as a neutral state. And I would even say that Russia and NATO come to an agreement to invest a certain amount of money into Ukraine to rebuild it as a neutral third-party state, similar to Switzerland.
So you reject the idea of releasing those areas as autonomous regions?
I don't think it's in the cards. That frankly,
no,
I have to play within real.
For your specific opinion, I understand it's not realistic.
Yeah.
We're doing a hypothetical.
My opinion is
hypothetically
no, I think annexing them is really the only reasonable solution at this point, and I would probably support that position simply because I would redo the referendums, though. I would do that.
No autonomy for peace.
I don't think that it's possible, and frankly, I think if I were in the Russian,
imagine that it's possible. Would you accept it as a negotiator? I'm Zelensky. This is my offer as Zelensky. All of those regions, you keep an indefinite contract for Sevastopol because that's Russian heavily invested. Fine, but like the Crimean Tatars, everybody else gets autonomy, and we have peace and autonomy.
Okay. Can I just say, I think the reason why this is having, I understand what you're trying to do here. I think the reason why there's not going to be any connect here with Lewis is Lewis so far in this debate has not been that considerate about what the Ukrainians actually want. About if they went to the voting booth and they put in a ballot, what would they ask for? Because the polling data all reflects that they disagree with Lewis's position. They want their territory to be liberated. 89% still believe that they should fight until the liberation of Crimea. That is an immense will to fight for their national sovereignty. And so far, since I think he has disregarded the wishes of Ukrainians so far. Crimea is the southern, well, we just had a discussion about the Crimean. Do you not know what?
You're talking about those areas, the southeast Ukraine is voting to keep fighting?
No, I'm saying that the polling data suggests
from Kiev.
Yeah, from all Ukrainian-controlled territory. But pre-war polling data still reflected that they didn't want to be part of Russia. But I'm talking about all of the areas that a pollster could realistically poll. Shows that those people who are the ones signing up to fight and the ones fighting are the ones saying that they're willing to go to those extents.
Yeah, that's good.
And so I think all the pre-war polling data reflected as well that the people of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson do not want to be part of a Russian state. They might have different beliefs about regulations on Russian language in public buildings, right? The same way in the United States, we might end up creating a policy about speaking English at the bank teller first before speaking Spanish, which is what the language law was that was passed. They might have different beliefs about that, but most of them don't have different beliefs about I am Ukrainian. Even if I speak Russian, even there's a cultural difference here, I am still Ukrainian. Same way there's Spanish-speaking Americans who still identify as American.
I understand. I want to just make sure I get an answer from you too, because you you explained the plausibility now. I understand you explained the realistic position that from the Ukrainian side, realistically, they're against this. I know. That's fine. I'm asking if you were in their shoes, as much as you can place yourself in their shoes, would you accept peace right now with no risk of any future developments? This could be guaranteed in some concrete way, but then we get autonomy in all of those regions, including Crimea.
So this is a scenario where I don't need to say I trust the Russians. It's just there's some institute, something that's making sure that they never invade again, right?
Well, they're getting quite. Listen,
I'm asking about the scenario. That's all I'm asking.
In this proposal, I think that it's not like implausible because Russia will get a lot of what they want. They could get this idea of neutrality of entire Ukraine, neutrality of these regions. They also get to save face in quite a bit if you assume that they're like. This might be impossible right now, but imagine in let's say a few months, Russia is under heavy pressure, and and then you offer that to them. Would you even offer that to them?
It would again depend upon what the local Ukrainians want. But if your question is if I'm a local Ukrainian, what would I say? I mean, hypothetically, yes, but it would depend upon what the structure would be that would guarantee another invasion happening. Because the thing is, there's this position about the federalization of Ukraine, which is a Russian position they've talked about before, that, hey, a solution to this might be federalizing Ukraine. But the fear of many Ukrainians, as you listen to Russian rhetoric of Ukraine not being a rightful state, it's not a real state, Ukrainian culture and identity is fake, and they're trying to deny, this culture and language that is Ukrainian. Dmitry Medvedev, Putin has repeated this on multiple occasions.
For sure.
They're fearful that if they federalize and they do this type of autonomous stuff that gets demilitarized, what stops the Russians from just invading again in 10 years in this area that's going to be super easy to invade because it's demilitarized, and it's going to be like 10 times easier in the future. Not to mention, if they wanted to strike Ukraine in the future, all those territories they can't pull soldiers from or resources from, or an ability to defend itself. Basically, this would guarantee that Ukraine moving forward would be a weaker state, a weaker entity, and a more vulnerable military position. So it would be very difficult for me to agree to this type of deal unless I understood some perfect mechanism that was going to stop Russia from doing this in the future. NATO membership, in my mind, does that because they're not going to fight a war with NATO. I don't know what type of entity could do that.
Now, Kaz, I'm going to give you one last follow-up. I extended your time quite significantly.
Thank you.
You've been very patient, and you're always very patient. That's why I love bringing you on. You always ask very intelligent questions. Usually, if you're not like screaming at a person. I love those Kaz appearances too, by the way. But go ahead. Go ahead.
Both people here, I don't know. It's for them to decide who was good faith or not. But I enjoyed the debate.
I did too very much.
And so I like that nobody is afraid to provide answers, even to some tough questions. And so I don't have a reason here to yell at everyone, because I believe that both sides are like actual debate participants. They're honest about trying to advance their agenda or push towards some truth. So I was very happy as a viewer.
So how can I trigger you today? No, I'm kidding, Cass. I'm kidding. Thanks so much for the call in, man. Thanks so much for your patience. We have to move on to the super chat segment of the show. We're at about the 2.5 hour mark. So it's going pretty much right on schedule. I love it. when it does that. One more shameless shout out. Make sure that you like, share, subscribe to The Crucible. It's one of the few places where you can still have good faith debates between combatants. This one was definitely a spirited debate, but I thought both of them, for the most part, were fairly respectful and made my job way easier. So moving into these, we're going to start with 2.2 Acres and a Bear, who renewed their Crucible membership 4 months running. Thank you so much. We appreciate that. Trope sent in a $2 super chat, and he said, Hypnotoad made me do it. That's why I play Hypnotoad. Wicked Wally sent in a $5 super chat, and he said, I don't want to go rushing into anything, but you can see where all the problems are if you crane your neck over that way. Wally, you suck. Your dad
Andrew,
jokes are terrible.
I saw enough war crimes in Ukraine. You don't need to show me more now.
Yeah, that was terrible. It was fucking awful. Not gonna lie, terrible. Okay, he followed up with another one for $5. He says, "Why do you call Dylan when he's questioning someone, or what do you call Dylan when he's questioning someone? Third-degree burns." Wally, you should just retire from fucking internet. It's terrible, terrible. Appreciate everybody who either renewed or picked up a membership tonight. We appreciate it very much. Raziel sent in a $5 super chat and says, Dylan, it's your FBI partner. Remember, don't let Lewis bring up Hunter Biden and the shady energy deals. Can everyone in the chat see this?
Look, I am a big supporter of Burisma. I think they've been given a bad rap in the media. I think they're great. I think America should have done many good business dealings. Many good. Was
this due to the crack-smoking, whoremongering advocate named Hunter?
I like to call him a patriot.
He's also super based, right?
I call him a patriot. I'm an open, and I've been an admitted supporter of Hunter Biden 2024. I think we should do a Hunter Biden. We should change the law, make Soros allowed to be VP. Hunter Biden, Soros ticket 2024. That's my agenda.
Was it the foot job from the Asian prostitute that sold you on that? I just just out of curiosity, you know? All right. We'll move on. That was kind of funny. Tim Zimlick sent in a $5 super chat and said, Dylan, calling this a post-truth debate is an admission, not an accusation.
What I meant by a post-truth debate is I felt like what this was going to basically be, and it ended up being, and this happens in a lot of debates now, especially since we have more of a broad media space that people, like back in the day, if you wanted to learn the news, you got to turn on your TV, you go to your one channel, or you got your paper, right? There was a high barrier to entry when it came. Now, anybody, including us, apparently, can report on the news. And so a lot of people are going to put out a lot of bogus bullshit. And now I believe that the things that I said today were true. Obviously, Lewis believes that the things he said was true, unless one of us has bad motives. And so since we both believe that our sources are correct, and if anybody wants to see mine afterwards, I'd be willing to provide any of my sources, it's just going to become me saying, you're right, you're wrong. And unless Andrew was going to stop it and we were going to review the sources, which I wish we were able to do, but I understand this is, we can't do that for every single claim made. It just becomes a post-truth debate, because if let's say I corner him, he could just say that's not true. He corners me, I could say that's not true, depending on if I'm lying or not, or if I have a bad source. So that's why I think it was like a post-truth debate, is because neither of us trusted either sources.
So it's interesting you bring this up. You've been a moderator for many of your own debates. I've done hundreds and hundreds. When you get into a sauce debate, it can be a bit tedious, but I think sometimes necessary. For future reference, that private chat tab is there. If you ever do want to provide a source, I'll pull it up on screen so people can see it.
Okay.
Just kind of letting you know that. So moving on from there, Tim Zimlick sent in $5 and said, Dylan, oh, I'm sorry, I already read that. Raziel 300 sent in a $5 super chat and said, Dylan, I realize now. The chat can see what I messaged you. Call him a transphobe for not supporting Zelensky and return to base.
True. Based. Transphobe Lewis. Mission accomplished.
Georgie Porgy sent in a $5 super chat. Best name on the internet. Lewis with the absolute beatdown. One of the top objective W's I've ever seen on the Crucible. Dylan's debriefing isn't going to be pretty.
Oh, no.
Kevin Kruger for $4.99 just says dot, which is not my favorite kind of super chat is when they send in the money with no message. But some people like to fuck with me by sending it because they know I'll read dot. You know, that's just the way it goes. Terry Barnes sends in $1.99, and he says Dylan serves imperialism, wittingly or not.
Okay.
Sleepy Giant sends in a $5 super chat and says, I'd say there's no threat of genocide. Stay out of it. Nukes or just firebombs.
I would recommend people go read the New Lines report on the threat to genocide on Ukraine. I think it's a really good report. I think it makes the case pretty clearly that the Russian state is pretty actively involved in trying to target the Ukrainian identity. They've been pretty open in that admission as well. The Russian Tsardom banned the Ukrainian language. It's also a historical precedent for Russia trying to target the Ukrainian identity. I don't know if I feel comfortable personally using the word genocide, especially when we don't know all the facts on the ground. But I do believe that the Russian state is pretty openly admitted in their targeting of the Ukrainian language and their targeting of Ukrainian identity. They don't believe it's valid. They talk about it all the time on state TV.
I have to follow up with one thing, right?
Yeah.
Since you said you have been very good faith this debate, and one of the things you just now said was, I would be very careful about calling it a genocide. You've seen all this trans genocide rhetoric everywhere.
Andrew,
right?
If you ask me this question, you're going to doom me, because the thing is, they're going to say far right activist Andrew asked Dylan if there's a trans genocide, and then that's going to be clipped, and then you're destroying me, Andrew. How dare you?
You got to answer the question, Dylan.
The answer is no. I don't think there's a trans genocide.
No, there's no fucking yes. Base, Dylan. Base.
I don't stop calling me base. It only hurts me. I do think there's discrimination.
That's why I'm doing it.
I do think I do think there are countries where there's more deliberate targeting. I would say Chechnya is an example of a country
not here.
where you actually have to talk
States.
about the idea of genocide against queers, because those are the countries where they actually had government facilities where they took gay people, tortured them, beat them. But I don't think that's going on in the United States. I do think that there is an argument, and some queer scholars have talked about the idea that the existence of conversion therapy centers and parents bringing their children could constitute some form, but that's not state sponsored. And so the idea of America doing it, I disagree with that.
I mean, come on. Isn't it ridiculous, though, to just say that, like, if you can't pump a kid with hormones, that it's being genocidal? Doesn't that seem like a stretch by any metric? Like, you're just kind of taking the word and throwing it in the fucking garbage. You know what I mean?
I think that people have good reasons to be very worried about the state of trans acceptance in this country and the rhetoric that's been flared up. I don't think it has reached the point of genocide. There's an argument to be made that it might be on tier 1 or tier 2 on the path to something like that. But any time in the world, there's a million different social minority groups or minority groups around the world who are on like tier 2 or tier 3 of that. It's of concern, but I don't think it's actively a genocide right now. I think the conditions for trans people in this country are not perfect, and there needs to be a lot of improvements, but I don't think there's a genocide now.
All right. Appreciate that. Tim Zimler, and yes, far-right activist Andrew Wilson, Dylan Burns agrees there is no trans genocide. Clip that shit. Put it out everywhere that you possibly can. Tim's okay, sorry. It's just Tim Zimlick for $5 says, no one of good conscience wants to engage in this nakedly corrupt cockfight with Russia. Ukraine must find a way to cooperate with their neighbors.
They were cooperating. Russia invaded them. When you invade a country, that's kind of like the opposite of cooperating. Everything past that point, I think, to some degree, was in a response to that invasion. They did not want to cooperate with a post-Yanukovych government on the existence of a Russian military base in Sevastopol. They thought they could play their hand and just take it. And now they pushed their cards a little bit. They got a little too greedy, and now they're facing the consequences of it with thousands of their boys coming home in coffins. It's very sad, but they can stop it at any point by leaving.
Gotcha. Kevin B sends in $5 and he says it's very sad that Ukraine and Russia soldiers, who are mostly Orthodox Christians, are killing each other. Is Zelensky a Christian?
I believe he's Jewish. Is that a problem? Is that becoming a problem? Is anybody? We can talk about the heads of Jewish companies now. We're moving that direction.
I mean, you moved it that direction.
I did.
I don't think either of us did.
No, I just asking. Oh wait, it's just
Are you an anti-Semite, Burns?
I was hanging with Kyrie Irving off screen. He's right over there with Kanye. They're partying right now in that room. But look, he's a Jewish leader of a Christian country. They elected him despite his religious disagreements. I think that's perfectly fine. I think he's generally performed quite well in this war. I think he's performed much better than anybody could have expected. The American experience with allies that we've participated with and worked with, like let's say Ashraf Ghani in Afghanistan, that gave us a bad taste in our mouth, just to say the least. And now I think a lot of Americans have a better taste in their mouth after having somebody who actually stayed to fight in the country instead of abandoning it at the first sign of trouble.
Okay.
Like Yanukovych did, by the way.
By the way, I just want to point out that I think it's interesting, and I kind of understand the reasoning behind it, but kind of the second religion's brought up, you interject Jewishness because it was like a bait, right? You're like hoping that there would be some kind of response where we'd be like, well, of course she, right? Something like that. No, wasn't that why you brought that up, Dylan?
I brought it up.
Wasn't it?
I brought it up. Actually, it's the reverse. I thought the question was bait. Like, oh, look at all these Orthodox and who's sending them to die? That's what I thought the question was. I was like, and I was basically saying, oh, is that the question? The question about the Jews? Which I thought it was. If I was wrong, then I was wrong.
Okay, gotcha. So one more quick follow-up. He did do pretty good for an actor who played the president, right?
I gotta say, I wouldn't have voted for him. I actually talked to a lot of people people I respect in Ukraine, and they're like, dude, I was a Poroshenko voter, and he wildly outperformed my expectations. I actually didn't like him before this war. And I think Ukrainians now have a very, very positive view of Zelensky in this war. Beforehand, he wasn't actually polling that well. I think he's completely changed his image in the public sphere in Ukraine.
Gotcha. Moving on, Kevin B sent in a $5 super chat, and he says it's very sad that Ukraine and Russian soldiers who are mostly Orthodox. Oh, I'm sorry, I already read that. Sorry, the stupid thing keeps moving backwards on me. The SIG P220 sent in a $5 super chat and says, Dylan, are you willing to sacrifice the U.S. to save Ukraine? Because you're blue, no matter who decisions have led to just that.
I don't think that us supporting Ukraine leads to the end of the United States. I think a lot of people have portrayed the nuclear threat to be a lot more significant than it actually is. I think a lot of people talk about nuclear Armageddon and that if Ukraine took back Kherson, it was going to be nuclear holocaust. If Ukraine took back Kharkiv, it was going to, the area around Kharkiv. If Ukraine takes this, take back. I don't think that it's that simple, that decision. I think a lot of people think Putin is like just a mindless beast, animal, a psychopath. He's going to press the button and destroy the world. I think he's calculated. I think he considers his options before doing them. I think the same about the Russian oligarchs, who are, of course, self-interested and don't want to see the world go kaboom. Launching of a nuclear weapon in Ukraine would not have too much tactical. I mean, it might have some tactical use, not much strategic use. They would really have to launch a lot of nukes to have a big impact. And you want to know what? Those nukes have to be delivered somehow. There has to be an order given. And I don't necessarily think if somebody was ordered to do it, they would necessarily do it. That has happened before, and a lot of times they've said no. And let's say they do go through with it. What about the fact that, at Chernobyl, a lot of the radiation was picked up in Sweden? That's actually how we found out Chernobyl was going on. Radiation carries. If they're going to use radioactive weapons, there's a decent chance with this proximity to Russia, they're going to bring radiation back into Russia. For what? A very small tactical advantage that doesn't change the strategic field that much? And that's on top of the fact there's going to be more sanctions, there's going to be diplomatic isolation, and if you want to make India and China agree to a price cap on Russian energy imports, this is the one thing they could do that might be enough to convince them, because they don't want to see the nuclear taboo go away. You think India wants to have Pakistan have this idea in their head that, oh, this is okay behavior. We could use nuclear weapons on a small scale and it's perfectly fine. China doesn't want North Korea to go AWOL because they don't want a refugee crisis on their border, and they don't want American bases in North Korea on their border. And so the international backlash is going to be immense for very little benefit. Like, what's the benefit? Then, not to mention the fact that America might actually respond. They might blow up their own shit. They might start blowing up either the Russian Black Sea fleet, or think we need to make sure there's a massive punishment for this. We cannot allow them to break the nuclear taboo. Basically, what I'm saying is not that it's impossible that this weapon's going to be used, but people talk about it very, very flippantly. very flippantly, like, oh, there's a really good chance Russia's going to do this. I think the chance is incredibly small, and U.S. strategic positioning around nuclear weapons has not really changed much because the risk is small.
Okay, appreciate that. Kevin B sent in another question after that for $10, and he says, Dylan and JY, Putin has accused the West of Satanism. That's true, he has. Does he have a point considering the outright degeneracy, porn, and sexual grooming of schools and children, etc.?
I think it's pretty relevant to what I think about that, but yeah, he does have a point, and it only bolsters his position with a lot of countries around the world who actually agree with this kind of assessment, and not just countries that are aligned in the more non-American sphere, but even American sphere countries are influenced by this rhetoric. So I think that it does nothing but harm America the more we dive into extremely radical policies like that.
So I think a lot of this rhetoric is being thrown at the wall because they're losing and they need to find a way to motivate their people. And you want to know what? Most people in Moscow, most people across the whole country don't care much about, at the end of the day, who controls Kherson when it comes down to the dinner table issues. Not enough to sign up to fight, at least, because hundreds of thousands of them are leaving the country trying to dodge the draft or aren't signing up to fight, especially people, for example, students, people in school. A lot of people are dodging the draft. And so I think for them, if you listen to Kadyrov ramble on his, I don't know if you guys ever went out and listened to Kadyrov ramble on Telegram, but when he's just these satanic homo trans Nazis in Ukraine are going to take over your homes, and they're going to make your kids gay, they're going to make them trans, they're going to doom your future. They're just fear-mongering. They're fear-mongering. There's no such thing as a homo, gay, trans Nazi or Nazism with homo characteristics or anything like that. That's not true. And so for me, I think it's just them trying to fear-monger to find some reason to make people sign up for military service. I don't think Russians are going to Ukraine to die to fight pornography and homosexuality. If they are, that's very sad and very stupid.
Okay, thank you for that response. JY, did you? Well, you already interact with it, actually. SigP220 for $10 says, does no one care that the only reason we're funding this war is because the Biden administration has vested interests? We suffer while the corruption strengthens. At what point do you disavow?
There's no corruption when it comes to Ukraine and the Biden family. The closest you could find, you could talk about Burisma.
That was pretty fucking corrupt.
The thing is, Hunter Biden is 100% a spoon-fed child who gets positions because his father was the vice president. That's true.
Well, so did Trump, but you fucked him up.
Yeah, so did the Trump family. For example, Jared Kushner became Middle East envoy. Why did he get that position? Was he the best person for the job? No, he was the president's son-in-law. And that happened for a lot of the people in the Trump family. That also happened with the Clintons, happened with many American political dynasties, especially the Bushes, for example. And this is something that has been a trend.
But you can't point at their nepotism and be like, that makes ours okay.
So I'm not saying it's okay. What I am saying is that it does not prove that Biden's interests in Ukraine or Biden's moves and political position in Ukraine is necessarily funded by corruption. There is no evidence ever provided in any money traded hands to the Biden family on behalf of Burisma for meetings with Biden that ended up manifesting in Burisma getting American energy or American government.
But Dylan, you don't really believe that,
if there was corruption, it failed.
Yeah, but Dylan,
this is just narrative.
You don't really believe, Dylan.
I really believe that, yes.
You don't really believe that this guy was put on an energy board in Ukraine with no experience whatsoever. And there was no greasing of the hands, really.
Hunter Biden is a drug addict who has shown himself to have erratic behavior. I don't think it's very crazy to imagine that Hunter Biden may have said some things to certain government officials or some businessmen about getting them things that he couldn't deliver on. That's why every single business arrangement the man had at the time that this was going on ended up failing or falling through, or he got fired, or it ended up in complete scandal, but none of it ever touched Biden as far as we're aware of at the timing and recording of this video. And until I have that evidence, I'm not just going to substantiate it and say I'm not going to go support Ukraine, because the possibility of Burisma paying by Hunter Biden, which might somehow possibly, but they didn't really have an impact Joe Biden. Like, I just, until there's proof, I can't.
But isn't that kind of turning a blind eye to like obvious corruption?
No,
like,
I
if there was
think
any,
it's bad. Wait, to be clear, I think it's bad. It shouldn't have done it. I don't think they should have done it whatsoever. I don't think Hunter Biden should have gotten those positions. But I don't think it's evidence of Ukraine manipulating the Biden family when it comes to Joe Biden like changing.
Well, it's the
policy of
opposite.
the United States.
I mean, it's the opposite. So you got a
Honestly,
really corrupt government.
I would think it's actually Hunter Biden manipulating a gas company.
Yeah, well, that's worse, though. That's worse.
But that's Hunter Biden, not Joe Biden.
Well, Joe Biden isn't exactly taking him to task for it, has he?
Well,
he's just been like, "Here's your crack money. Go fuck that prostitute." Right? That's been how it's gone.
I think he's from the phone calls that have been leaked from the Biden laptop. If people want to talk about that, the calls that was with him with Biden was literally just like, I don't know what to do with you. I want to help you, but you're so addicted. It's like very like obviously not crazily, this guy wanted his son to get off of drugs and to get a career. And as far as I know, he was basically supportive of him. Oh, you got a new job? Great. Fantastic. And that was it, because he wanted his drug addict son to have a reliable job and not be a drug addict.
To comment on this one thing. I think that this entire spiel that you had between Andrew is endemic of the entire debate. You will spin a narrative any way you want as long as it supports your position. So
Lewis,
you will
you're gonna
spin
give me
that
any
narrative.
evidence? Give me the corruption evidence, Lewis. Okay, because what I'm saying is just the knowledge.
Sitting on a foreign board.
Ukraine's not
experience, and
corrupt.
His dad was a politician.
To be
prominent politician.
To be clear, Andrew, I think you're being a little facetious here.
He wants the FBI to release data and be like, here it is.
I am being. It's true, but it's also there's truth in it.
But what I'm saying. And Lewis, if you want to object to this, please do, because I don't think you have anything to prove me wrong here, is that it's nepotism, and nepotism is bad, but there's no evidence of physical corruption that occurred that changed Biden's position on foreign policy.
Yeah, what about that?
Fire that prosecutor.
What about the fact that his partner,
Lewis, you don't have
his
any.
You're not getting the money. Well, they fired the prosecutor.
But his partner was
Lewis,
slated
you don't
to
have
do
any evidence. Don't.
Well, hang on. His partner was slated to do a 60
What do you mean, Joe Biden's
interview.
own mouth?
Dude, he bragged about getting a prosecutor that was prosecuting Burisma. His son just happened to be on.
Yes, 100%. You don't know all the information about this, Lewis. You don't know all about
this entire debate. You admit how obviously corrupt this is.
You have no idea what you're talking about, Lewis. Every leader in Europe wanted that prosecutor fired, and they were attempting to get that prosecutor fired.
Oh my gosh, that's because Europe is on a choke chain.
All right, hang on. Let him finish.
He fire hydrant the last 3 questions, like 20 minutes. And
the thing is, it's like it's all fair in love and war, right? So listen, there is one thing I will say about this though. It's like, from my perspective, it sure looks to me like Democrats are just like, this is fucking beyond blatant, and they're just like, whatever though, because sure, the guy's a fucking crackhead piece of shit. He's getting foot jobs in a hotel. His partner was trying to name him, all this different shit that was coming out about him, but they're just kind of like, yeah, there's nothing to see here. Move along. Now, do Republicans do that too? Yes. Do I hate Republicans almost as much as Democrats? Yes, but in this case, it's like, just say the guy's a piece of fucking shit. Just be like, he's a piece of fucking shit.
Andrew, that's not all that's being said, though. Lewis is making the claim right now that Ukrainian corruption made Biden go to Ukraine and advocate for a prosecutor being fired because he was prosecuting the company his son was on the board of, when we know that he was vice president of the United States at the time that every European leader was asking for that prosecutor to be fired. Every American leader in foreign policy wanted that prosecutor fired, and you want to know what? That prosecutor deserved to be fired because the prosecutor was terribly corrupt.
They weren't all holding up foreign money until he got fired.
And the United States knew that if they wanted to make any long-term arrangements with Ukraine when it came to security or economics, they were going to need a less corrupt state to work with them, because corruption undermines the state's ability to function. And we understood that if we were going to give them our money and our aid. And so we asked them, like, hey, if you want American aid, you're going to have to deal with corruption so we don't have all of our aid get pissed down the drain. I think that's perfectly reasonable, and it was good to have that prosecutor
Well,
fired.
that all would, I think all of that may be a really compelling case, except for the fact that I can't think of any other official who was like, we're going to hold up your fucking aid until you do it.
Because he's the vice president. He was working his job. He was doing his job. What do you mean? What other American official should have done it?
You want to know why
The
all
president,
the
the president could,
so the
hang on, the president, yeah, the president.
The vice president often works as the person who communicates. The
But he said, "I'm going to call Obama
there
and
as a
tell him."
representative and will do whatever's necessary to get the president's wishes done." The
Dylan,
president of the United States wanted the prosecutor fired. He sent Joe Biden to do it.
Well, it sure looked to me like it was just cope, and he was like,
let's be honest.
I'm going to keep my hands off of it.
Lewis,
That's
this
what
is going to be the millionth claim you've made without evidence. Tell me how they greased the hands and how it affected the firing, please.
He admitted to it. He said,
He
"I will
didn't
get the
admit to it.
prosecutor
Yeah,
fired."
yeah, good.
Yeah,
He
and he's
needed the
like, "What'd you
prosecutor
know?"
needed to be
No,
fired.
and
There's no
all those-
evidence that
and
it
you
was because
keep
of
on
Burisma.
appealing. You keep on appealing to European leaders. They all wanted him fired. Yeah, because the U.S. has them by the leash, dude.
So you think
they are on the
okay.
beck and call of America? You
So-
know that. You know that, but you won't admit it because you're an ideologue.
Your claim is bizarre. So your claim is that
Bizarre.
Burisma paid
That
Hunter
Europe
Biden.
doesn't have
No, let me
independence.
shut the fuck up. That Biden basically was influenced by Burisma paying Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden then communicates the wishes of Burisma to Joe Biden, or makes them communicate, even though there's no record of this happening, makes them communicate that, hey, we need you to fire this prosecutor. Biden then goes to the president and makes the president, or whatever the government does, to make other European leaders around the world who are now being dragged into the scandal to go advocate for this prosecutor to be fired. And then months after all these European leaders asked for this prosecutor to be fired, and all these other world, like NGOs and all these groups, asked for the prosecutor to be fired, after the Ukrainian community asked for this prosecutor to be fired, Joe Biden goes and fires him. This is the claim you're making?
How far and how often do you have to lick between the toes of Joe Biden to make
You
these
have
claims,
nothing to
dude?
substantiate that. You have
I
nothing.
do. I mean, we gave claims.
Prove
you just
it.
hand
Prove
waved
it.
them and,
You have-
and used
no,
this
you
narrative.
didn't have any
thing.
evidence.
You
You're
did the
just
same
saying,
thing you did
you're
the
just
whole
saying
debate.
Burisma paid Hunter Biden.
This
I
whole,
didn't
the
object
whole
to that.
debate.
I'm objecting
you
to
just
everything you're reading out
weave
of
a
that.
narrative and say, "Well,
right.
Ukrainians told me this, and it's true because Ukrainians said."
guys,
It's viciously circular logic.
we're so close to being able to get out of here at the 3-hour mark. We're so close. We're going to try to get
I will
there,
fight for
okay?
Joe Biden.
John Hoffman,
You know, I saw him
who by-
speak like 5 days ago, actually.
who, by the way, John Hoffman, he's been a longtime supporter of the Crucible. We thank him for that very much. He sent in a $5 super chat. It says nothing, my favorite kind of super chat. The SIG P220, he sent in a $5 super chat and said his business partner did a 60 minutes interview naming Joe.
What do you mean? What did he name? What did he show? What did he prove? He named Joe? Yeah. Hunter Biden got the job because he's the son of the president of the United States, and the company probably wanted access to Joe Biden. There's no evidence anything ever came of that, because Hunter Biden was a drugged up, sad man, and he couldn't really do much in any job position he was ever given, including when he did those business dealings with the Chinese, which all collapsed. Everything Hunter Biden touched at that time, due to his addiction, collapsed. So I have a very hard time believing that Hunter Biden was able to peddle influence enough to get a prosecutor, an influential, corrupt prosecutor in Ukraine, fired. That prosecutor could do much more shuffling than Hunter Biden.
Appreciate that. Raziel sends in a $5 super chat and says, isn't that what Trump got impeached for, though, withholding aid? Biden admits it on TV, but it's not corruption.
What do you want me to respond to? Like,
Well,
why is it that he mentions what on TV? What did Biden mention on TV?
That he held up aid going to the country until a prosecutor who was looking into Burisma, which is the company that his son was working on the board of,
all
was
speculation.
he was fired. That's all.
This was a priority of multiple states to get this guy fired. We're reading intent with no evidence. I don't believe Hunter Biden had enough influence to get this prosecutor fired. He was too drugged up and sad.
Well, I got to ask you a question then, because Joe Biden in the clip, he says, sure enough, the second I was going to withhold that aid money, He was fired just like
Yes,
that.
he helped get him fired. Yes, Joe Biden
Well,
did that.
was it helped, or was he saying I was completely responsible for
Yes,
her?
he was the main person who was able to get the job done because
Yes, I mean, it just looks bad.
because these other European states were not giving Ukraine the same aid that we were giving them, and Ukraine was in a desperate position, so they chose the aid over a corrupt prosecutor with influence, who was trying to use his influence to stay in power.
Yeah, well, the thing is, chat.
Okay, let's be for real.
Well, I'm just saying
If we're going to give aid to any country, they cannot be we got to.
I'm just saying to the chat, like, this is not what the debate was, of course. We just went off on, like, a little side tangent. Anyway, go ahead, Dylan.
I'm just saying, like, if we're going to give aid to any country, we should probably make sure that the aid isn't going to be pissed down the drain on like prostitutes and blow, We should make sure that this actually goes to the intended purposes, right? I think that's important. And so if we were going to give aid to Ukraine, I think one of the requirements for giving aid to Ukraine should be the firing of people who are not going to prosecute. The thing is, the prosecutor was corrupt. He's the guy who's supposed to prosecute guys on corruption, and he's corrupt. It destroys the whole system of dealing with corruption, which was necessary for them to get aid. And that is why we specifically said, if you don't fire this guy, you're not going to get our aid. And then they fired the guy because they wanted the aid.
I have like 300 rejoinders for that, but it'll be for another day and another time. For $5, Joseph Newton says, J.Y. Lewis, great job. Keep on dunking on these clowns. Appreciate that. This is over on Dono Chat, by the way. $5 from Risky Dave, and he just puts in a $sign. Love it. $5 from Sterling, and he says, this super chat is for Rachel's pool cleaning supply fund and nothing else. Well, the thing is that I'll use the super chats how I see fit. She's married to me, and as we all know, as a conservative, I only marry women who are subservient slaves. Right? So, anyway, it's a joke, Dylan. Calm down. Calm down. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming out tonight to the Crucible. We got out of here at the 3-hour, 2-minute mark. Highly impressed with that. We were very close to the time schedule. Dylan Burns, take a second, shout your channel out to everybody where they can find you.
Look, I just want everybody to go to joebiden.com and donate $20 for Joe Biden's re-election campaign. That's what you can do to help me and help poor children everywhere who just need a leg up. They want a child tax credit. They want an infrastructure bill. They want the Inflation Reduction Act. So go to joebiden.com and reward him for his amazing midterm results, breaking history as Joe Biden shows himself to be the most popular elected leader in world history. Thank you very much. You can find me at Dylan Burns TV on YouTube, Dylan Burns TV on Twitch, DylanBurnsTV. On Twitter, it's Dylan Burns 1776, because God bless this country.